A 70-year-old mathematician arrives at Harvard in 1924, abandoning the logical certainties that made him famous. Alfred North Whitehead had spent decades constructing the foundations of mathematics alongside Bertrand Russell, yet something fundamental troubled him about the world their work described. The equations were elegant, the proofs rigorous, but the living universe seemed to slip through their logical nets like water through a sieve. Numbers and formulas captured relationships beautifully, but they could not grasp the throbbing immediacy of experience itself. This mathematician would spend his remaining years constructing the most ambitious philosophical system of the 20th century. Not content to patch existing theories, Whitehead rebuilt metaphysics from the ground up, creating a vision where mathematics and mysticism, science and poetry, logic and lived experience could finally coexist. His philosophy of organism would challenge every assumption Western thought held dear about the nature of reality, consciousness and God. Yet it would do so not through mystical proclamations, but through rigorous analysis of what our best science actually reveals about the universe we inhabit. Part 1. The Revolt against Substance. The philosophical tradition Whitehead inherited rested on a deceptively simple assumption. Reality consists fundamentally of substances, things that exist independently and possess various properties. A stone has hardness, weight and colour. A mind has thoughts, feelings and memories. These substances interact causally, but remain essentially separate entities, occupying distinct locations in space and time. This substance ontology had dominated Western metaphysics since Aristotle, receiving its most sophisticated expression in Descartes' division of reality into mental and material substances. Whitehead diagnosed this entire framework as fundamentally mistaken. The error began with what he termed the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, our tendency to treat high-level abstractions as if they were the most concrete realities. We abstract the concept of unchanging stone from our flowing perceptual experience, then mistakenly conclude that static substances are more real than the dynamic processes from which we derived them. This intellectual move, however useful for practical purposes, inverts the actual relationship between abstraction and concreteness. Consider the seemingly simple statement that a stone is hard. Traditional metaphysics locates the hardness as a property inherent in the substantial stone. But phenomenological analysis reveals something far more complex. Hardness emerges only through the interaction between the molecular vibrations constituting the stone, the pressure applied by our fingers, the sensitivity of our nerve endings, and the interpretive activity of our consciousness. Remove any component of this relational web, and the hardness vanishes. The hardness exists nowhere as an isolated property, but everywhere as a pattern of relationships between interacting processes. This insight led Whitehead to propose a radical alternative. Instead of building reality from static substances that somehow acquire dynamic properties, he began with dynamic processes that achieve temporary stability through their internal organization. Process becomes ontologically prior to substance. What we call things are actually societies of processes, maintaining recognizable patterns across time. The stone persists, not because some unchanging substance endures beneath its changing properties, but because countless microscopic processes repeatedly achieve similar organizational patterns moment after moment. Permanence emerges from change rather than limiting it. This process ontology immediately dissolves several classical philosophical problems. The mind-body problem plagued substance dualism because mental and physical substances seemed to belong to utterly different ontological categories. How could an immaterial mind interact with material bodies? Process philosophy eliminates this mystery by recognizing both mental and physical phenomena as different types of process, not different kinds of substance. The difference between a thought and an electron lies in the complexity and organization of their constituent processes, not in their fundamental ontological status. Both involve actual occasions of experience organized into different temporal and spatial patterns. The philosophical implications extend far beyond solving technical puzzles. Substance thinking encourages us to view ourselves as isolated individuals accidentally related to an external world. Process thinking reveals our constitutive interconnection with everything that influences our becoming. We are not substances that have relationships, but patterns of relationships that achieve temporary selfhood. This shift in perspective transforms ethics, politics, and spirituality by making interdependence ontologically fundamental rather than morally optional. Environmental destruction becomes self-destruction because the boundaries between self and environment are abstract constructions rather than concrete separations. Whitehead's revolt against substance also reconstructs our understanding of causation. Traditional causal thinking imagines one substantial thing pushing or pulling another substantial thing, like billiard balls colliding on a table. This mechanistic model works reasonably well for certain macroscopic phenomena, but breaks down completely at quantum scales, where particles exist in superposition states and measurement interactions determine properties. Process causation operates through what Whitehead called Prehension, a form of responsive grasping whereby each process takes account of its environment and incorporates selected aspects into its own becoming. Causation becomes a creative synthesis rather than a mechanical transmission. Each actual occasion exercises genuine choice in how it responds to causal influences, introducing novelty into the causal web rather than merely transmitting predetermined forces. This reconstruction of causation provides the metaphysical foundation for genuine creativity in nature. Mechanistic causation allows only the rearrangement of pre-existing elements according to deterministic laws. Nothing genuinely new can emerge because everything that happens was already implicit in prior conditions, plus universal laws. Process causation makes room for authentic novelty because each occasion's creative synthesis generates possibilities that did not exist before. The universe becomes genuinely creative rather than merely computational. Evolution produces real innovations rather than just more complex arrangements of unchanged fundamentals. The mathematical background that shaped Whitehead's thinking becomes crucial here. His work with Russell on Principia Mathematica had demonstrated that mathematical entities like numbers and sets are actually patterns of relationships rather than independent objects. The number 3 does not exist somewhere as a substantial entity, but rather emerges wherever certain relational patterns obtain. This mathematical insight suggested that all reality might consist of relational patterns rather than substantial entities. Physical particles, biological organisms, psychological states, and social institutions all exhibit the same basic structure as mathematical entities, existing as patterns of relationships that achieve stability through their internal coherence rather than through their substantial independence. Mathematics thus became a clue to the fundamental structure of reality rather than merely a useful tool for describing an independently existing material world. Part 2. Actual occasions of experience. Every philosophical system requires fundamental building blocks, irreducible elements from which all complexity emerges. For ancient atomists, these were indivisible particles moving in void. For Cartesian dualism, mental and material substances provided the basic categories. Whitehead's process philosophy grounds itself in what he termed actual occasions of experience, the final real things of which the universe is composed. An actual occasion represents a quantum of becoming, a discrete drop of experience that emerges, achieves satisfaction, and perishes in a temporally atomic moment. Unlike traditional atoms, which were conceived as miniature versions of macroscopic objects, actual occasions are fundamentally experiential rather than material. They do not have experience as an accidental property, but rather are experience in its most elementary form. This does not mean they possess consciousness in any human sense, but rather that they exhibit the basic structure of responsive synthesis that characterizes all experience at whatever level of complexity. The temporal atomicity of actual occasions solves several mathematical and philosophical puzzles that had plagued earlier process philosophies. Henry Bergson and William James had emphasized the flowing, continuous nature of experience, but struggled to explain how discrete objects and events could emerge from purely continuous becoming. Whitehead's solution involved recognizing that process itself must be composed of discrete temporal quanta, each representing a complete cycle of becoming. Just as energy comes in discrete packets according to quantum mechanics, so temporal becoming occurs in discrete occasions rather than smooth continuity. Each actual occasion follows what Whitehead called the genetic analysis of becoming. This process begins with the initial phase of conformal feelings, where the emerging occasion responsively grasps aspects of its actual environment. These initial prehensions are largely automatic, determined by the causal efficacy of the past actual world. But as the occasion develops through successive phases, it exercises increasing creativity in how it integrates and synthesizes these inherited elements. The process culminates in the satisfaction phase, where the occasion achieves its final determinate form and adds itself to the objective immortality of the past. Once satisfied, the occasion immediately perishes as a living subject, but remains forever as an objective datum for future occasions. This genetic structure explains how genuine novelty can emerge within a causally interconnected universe. The conformal phase ensures causal continuity by requiring each occasion to take account of its relevant past. But the later phases of becoming involve what Whitehead termed conceptual feelings, where the occasion entertains pure possibilities and explores alternative ways of integrating its inherited data. These conceptual feelings introduce an element of final causation, whereby the occasion's aim toward its own satisfaction influences how it synthesizes causal influences from efficient causation. The result is a universe where each moment involves both mechanical determination and creative self-determination, avoiding both absolute determinism and arbitrary randomness. The experiential nature of actual occasions does not imply that electrons have beliefs or that rocks feel emotions. Whitehead distinguished between different grades of experience based on their complexity and intensity. The most primitive forms of experience involve only physical prehensions, simple responsive grasping of other actual occasions without any conscious awareness or symbolic representation. As occasions organize into more complex societies, higher forms of experience emerge, including emotional responsiveness, conscious perception, and eventually self-conscious reflection. Human experience represents an extraordinarily complex synthesis of millions of actual occasions organized into nested societies within the broader society of the body. But even human consciousness follows the same basic pattern of prehension, integration, and satisfaction that characterizes every actual occasion at every level of reality. This panpsychist dimension of Whitehead's philosophy often generates misunderstanding and resistance. Critics worry that attributing experience to electrons anthropomorphizes nature or collapses important distinctions between conscious and unconscious processes. Whitehead responded that the reverse is actually true. Rather than anthropomorphizing nature, process philosophy naturalizes consciousness by revealing its continuity with simpler forms of responsive synthesis found throughout nature. The mystery is not how consciousness could emerge from purely unconscious matter, but how the complex forms of experience we call consciousness could develop from the simpler forms of experience that constitute the physical world. The doctrine of actual occasions also provides Whitehead's solution to the classical problem of the one and the many. Traditional substance philosophy struggled to explain how ultimate reality could be both unified and diverse. If reality consists fundamentally of one substance, diversity becomes merely apparent, but if it consists of many independent substances, genuine unity becomes impossible. Actual occasions are irreducibly many, each representing a unique perspective on the universe and a novel synthesis of inherited elements. But they achieve unity through their mutual prehensions, creating networks of influence and sympathy that bind the many occasions into larger wholes without destroying their individual creativity. Unity and diversity become complementary aspects of the same process rather than competing metaphysical principles. The spatial and temporal characteristics of actual occasions require careful analysis because they differ dramatically from our ordinary concepts of space and time. Each occasion occupies a quantum of the extensive continuum, a region of space-time that cannot be subdivided into smaller regions occupied by other occasions. This extensive quantum provides the standpoint from which the occasion prehends the rest of the universe, its unique perspective on the totality of what has become actual. But the occasion's spatial extension should not be confused with simple location, the notion that objects exist at definite places independent of their relationships. An occasion's spatial region is constituted by its prehensions rather than containing them, making space itself a product of the relational activity between occasions rather than an independent container within which occasions happen to be located. This relational theory of space-time aligns process philosophy with Einstein's general relativity while providing a metaphysical foundation for understanding how space-time curvature could be influenced by the presence of mass energy. Part 3. Prehension and the Fabric of Relations. Prehension constitutes the fundamental activity by which actual occasions relate to their environment and achieve their own determinate form. The term derives from the Latin prehendere, meaning to grasp or seize, but Whitehead extended its meaning beyond physical grasping to include all forms of responsive taking account of that characterize experience at every level. Unlike mechanical interactions that operate through contact forces between independent substances, prehensions involve sympathetic resonance between occasions that enables them to incorporate aspects of their environment into their own becoming. This makes prehension the basic building block of all relationships, from quantum entanglement to conscious perception to emotional sympathy. Whitehead distinguished between positive and negative prehensions based on whether the prehending occasion actively incorporates or actively excludes elements from its environment. Positive prehensions bring aspects of other occasions into the constitution of the prehending subject, contributing to its determinate character and emotional tone. Negative prehensions involve the active rejection of possible influences, but this rejection still contributes to the occasion's definiteness by determining what it chooses not to become. Every occasion must prehend every other occasion in its actual universe. But most of these prehensions will be negative, filtering out the vast majority of potential influences to achieve a manageable synthesis. This explains how finite occasions can exist in an infinite universe without being overwhelmed by unlimited complexity. Selective attention and focused responsiveness are not merely psychological phenomena, but express fundamental metaphysical principles that operate at every level of reality. Physical prehensions represent the most primitive and widespread form of responsive grasping. When one actual occasion physically prehends another, it reproduces aspects of the prehended occasion's emotional tone and intensive characteristics within its own experience. This process underlies what we ordinarily call causal influence, but it operates through sympathetic reproduction rather than mechanical transmission. The prehending occasion does not receive some substantial thing from the prehended occasion, but rather recreates relevant patterns of feeling and intensity within its own unique synthesis. This explains how causal influence can operate across spatial gaps without requiring some mysterious action at a distance or the transmission of substantial particles through intervening space. Quantum entanglement becomes less mysterious when understood as a form of direct prehensional relationship that transcends spatial separation. Conceptual prehensions introduce a fundamentally different dimension of responsiveness that becomes increasingly important in higher-grade occasions. While physical prehensions grasp actual occasions that have already achieved determinate form, conceptual prehensions grasp eternal objects, pure possibilities that may or may not be actualized in particular occasions. This conceptual dimension enables occasions to transcend mere reproduction of their past and explore alternative patterns of synthesis. An occasion might conceptually prehend the possibility of redness, while physically prehending actual occasions that lack any red components, thus introducing genuinely novel elements into its own becoming. Conceptual prehension is what makes creativity possible by allowing occasions to synthesize what is actual with what is merely possible, generating new forms that did not exist in their environment. Without this conceptual dimension, the universe would be condemned to endless repetition of already actualized patterns. The integration of physical and conceptual prehensions occurs through what Whitehead called hybrid prehensions, complex feelings that involve both actual and possible elements. These hybrid forms of prehension become especially significant in conscious experience, where perceived objects are never simply reproduced but always synthesized with conceptual possibilities. When you see a red apple, your perception involves physical prehensions of actual light waves and retinal stimulations, but it also involves conceptual prehensions of redness, roundness, and appleness as eternal objects. The experienced red apple emerges from the creative synthesis of actual physical data with relevant conceptual possibilities, making perception itself a form of artistic creation rather than mere mechanical registration. Whitehead's analysis of prehension also illuminates the temporal structure of experience. Physical prehensions are always prehensions of the actual past because only completed occasions can serve as definite data for new becoming. The immediate present represents the creative synthesis of these inherited prehensions with conceptual possibilities, while the future exists only as a realm of potential prehensions that may or may not be actualized. This temporal asymmetry explains why we can remember the past but not the future, why causation operates from past to future rather than the reverse, and why the passage of time involves the creative actualization of possibilities rather than the mere unfolding of predetermined outcomes. The doctrine of Prehension provides Whitehead's alternative to traditional theories of knowledge and perception. Instead of beginning with a knowing subject that somehow gains access to independent objects, process philosophy starts with the prehensional relationships through which subjects and objects co-emerge. The prehending occasion becomes a subject through its active synthesis of prehended data, while the prehended occasions become objects by virtue of being prehended. Subject and object are relational roles within the prehensional process rather than independent substances that somehow manage to interact. This dissolves the traditional epistemological problem of how subjects can gain knowledge of objects by revealing knowledge as a form of prehensional relationship rather than a mysterious bridging of an ontological gap. We know other things by prehending them, and we can prehend them because we share with them the same fundamental structure of experiential becoming. The social implications of prehension extend far beyond individual psychology to encompass all forms of community and communication. Human societies exist through the mutual prehensions that bind individual occasions into larger patterns of coordinated activity. Language operates through shared conceptual prehensions that enable different individuals to entertain the same eternal objects and thus coordinate their responses to common situations. Cultural transmission occurs through the inheritance of prehensional patterns across generations of occasions, allowing innovations to spread and evolve within social matrices. Even economic and political systems can be understood as complex networks of prehensional relationships that coordinate the activities of countless individual occasions toward larger social purposes. This prehensional analysis of society avoids both individualism, which treats social relationships as accidental connections between independent substances, and collectivism, which treats individuals as mere parts of substantial social wholes. Part 4. The Philosophy of Organism. Whitehead termed his mature philosophical system the Philosophy of Organism to emphasize its rejection of mechanistic reductionism in favor of a biological model of reality. The machine metaphor that dominated modern science treated nature as a collection of independent parts, following external laws like gears in a clockwork mechanism. The organism metaphor reveals nature as a community of interdependent processes achieving coordination through their internal relationships, like cells in a living body. This shift in metaphors transforms our understanding of causation, emergence, complexity, and the relationship between parts and wholes. Organisms differ from machines in several crucial respects that illuminate the structure of reality at every level. Machines are assembled from pre-existing parts that retain their essential characteristics regardless of their mechanical context. Organisms develop through the differentiation of an initial unity, with each part acquiring its definite character through its functional relationships with other parts within the organic whole. A heart removed from a body ceases to be a heart in any meaningful sense, while a gear removed from a clock remains essentially the same gear. This organic relationship between part and whole characterizes actual occasions and their societies at every level of the cosmic hierarchy. Occasions achieve their determinate character through their relationships with other occasions, and societies emerge through the coordinated activities of their constituent occasions. Whitehead's concept of society provides the key to understanding how temporary stabilities emerge within the flux of process. A society consists of a sequence of actual occasions that inherit certain defining characteristics from their predecessors, thus maintaining a recognizable pattern across time despite the constant perishing and renewal of the constituent occasions. What we ordinarily call enduring objects, from electrons to human personalities, are actually temporal societies exhibiting sufficient stability to maintain their defining characteristics through environmental changes. The electron is not a substantial particle that somehow persists through time, but rather a society of electronic occasions that repeatedly achieve similar patterns of organization. This societal analysis dissolves the classical problem of personal identity that plagued substance philosophy. If personal identity depends on the persistence of some substantial soul or ego, then the continuous changes evident in human development become philosophically problematic. How can someone remain the same person while constantly changing physically, psychologically, and intellectually over decades of development? Whitehead's solution treats personal identity as a form of social continuity, maintained through the inheritance of defining characteristics rather than the persistence of an unchanging substance. You remain the same person through time because the successive occasions of your experience inherit and creatively modify patterns of memory, character, and purpose that maintain sufficient continuity to constitute a recognizable social identity. Personal development becomes ontologically fundamental rather than accidentally superimposed on an unchanging core self. The hierarchical organization of societies explains how complexity can emerge without violating the fundamental principle that actual occasions are the final realities. Simple societies consist of occasions that share basic physical or electromagnetic characteristics. These simple societies can become members of more complex societies that coordinate multiple simple societies into larger functional wholes. Biological organisms represent extraordinarily complex hierarchies of societies, from subatomic societies to cellular societies to organ societies to the dominant society of the central nervous system. Each level of organization exhibits emergent properties that cannot be reduced to the simple summation of properties found at lower levels, yet every level ultimately consists of actual occasions following the same fundamental principles of prehension and creative synthesis. This explains how genuine emergence can occur without requiring mysterious substantial entities that somehow transcend the causal order. The philosophy of organism also provides Whitehead's solution to the classical mind-body problem that had plagued dualistic philosophies. Instead of treating mind and body as different kinds of substance that somehow interact, process philosophy recognizes both mental and physical phenomena as different types of society exhibiting different patterns of organization and complexity. Physical societies are characterized by the massive reproduction of similar patterns across enormous numbers of constituent occasions, creating the statistical regularities we observe as natural laws. Mental societies involve much smaller numbers of occasions, exhibiting much greater complexity and creativity in their individual syntheses, resulting in the flexible responsiveness and innovative capacity characteristic of consciousness. This analysis explains why mind and body can interact so intimately without violating physical laws or requiring supernatural intervention. The dominant mental society that we call consciousness exists within and emerges from the complex physical societies that constitute the brain and nervous system. Mental occasions prehend the physical occasions of the brain, inheriting their causal influences and adding new levels of creative synthesis that can influence subsequent brain states through the recursive prehensions that bind all members of an organic society. Mental causation operates through the same prehensional mechanisms as physical causation, but at higher levels of complexity that introduce greater creativity and flexibility into the causal web. The organic model also transforms our understanding of evolution from a merely external process of environmental selection to an internal process of creative experimentation. Darwinian evolution explains how successful variations are preserved and propagated, but it does not explain how variations arise in the first place. Process philosophy locates the source of evolutionary novelty in the creative activity of actual occasions themselves, which constantly experiment with new patterns of synthesis and occasionally achieve innovations that prove advantageous for survival and reproduction. Evolution becomes a cosmic creative process, rather than merely a biological mechanism, operating at every level from atomic to astronomical through the same fundamental principles of creative experimentation and selective inheritance. The philosophy of organism extends beyond biology to encompass social and cultural evolution as well. Human societies are forms of social organism that evolve through the creative innovations of their constituent members and the selective inheritance of successful cultural patterns. Technological development, artistic creation, moral progress, and scientific discovery all exhibit the same basic pattern of creative experimentation, followed by selective inheritance that characterizes biological evolution. This makes cultural development continuous with natural development while preserving the distinctive characteristics that emerge at higher levels of organizational complexity. Human consciousness represents not a supernatural addition to an otherwise mechanistic nature, but rather the flowering of creative tendencies that operate throughout the natural order. Culture and nature are phases of a single cosmic process of creative evolution. Part 5. Creativity as the ultimate. At the apex of Whitehead's categorical scheme stands creativity, the ultimate principle that transcends all metaphysical distinctions while making them possible. Creativity is not a thing or being in any conventional sense, but rather the fundamental activity by which the universe continuously generates novelty from the synthesis of actual and possible elements. It operates in every moment of becoming, every prehensional relationship, every creative synthesis that transforms many influences into novel unities. Without creativity, the universe would collapse into static repetition or dissolve into chaotic multiplicity. But creativity ensures that each moment achieves genuine novelty while maintaining sufficient coherence to provide a foundation for future creative advance. Whitehead's conception of creativity differs fundamentally from traditional theological concepts of creation ex nihilo, creation from nothing. Classical theology imagined God creating the world by imposing divine will on primordial nothingness, producing a finished cosmos that thereafter required only conservation and governance. Process creativity operates continuously throughout the cosmic process, not as a single primordial act, but as the ongoing principle by which the universe creates itself through the creative activities of its constituent occasions. Every actual occasion exercises creativity by synthesizing its inherited prehensions into a novel pattern of satisfaction that adds something genuinely new to the cumulative reality of the universe. This democratic distribution of creativity throughout reality explains how genuine novelty can emerge at every level of the cosmic hierarchy without requiring supernatural intervention. Physical occasions exhibit creativity through their unique syntheses of electromagnetic influences, gravitational relationships, and quantum potentialities. Biological occasions add higher forms of creativity through their integration of environmental information with inherited genetic patterns, producing the adaptive innovations that drive evolutionary development. Conscious occasions achieve the most complex forms of creativity through their synthesis of perception, memory, imagination, and rational reflection, generating the cultural innovations that characterize human civilization. The principle of creativity operates through what Whitehead called the creative advance into novelty, the ongoing process by which the universe transcends its past achievements while building upon them. Each phase of cosmic development provides the foundation for more complex phases, but the transition from one phase to another cannot be explained by mechanical causation alone. The emergence of life from non-living matter, consciousness from unconscious life, and rational reflection from instinctive consciousness all require creative leaps that transcend their causal antecedents while remaining grounded in them. These emergent transitions are made possible by creativity, which enables novel syntheses that could not be predicted from prior conditions, yet remain causally continuous with them. Creativity also provides the metaphysical foundation for aesthetic experience and artistic creation. Every actual occasion achieves what Whitehead termed aesthetic satisfaction through its creative synthesis of diverse prehensions into a harmonious unity that balances complexity with simplicity, contrast with compatibility, novelty with tradition. This aesthetic dimension of reality means that beauty is not accidentally superimposed on an otherwise purely mechanical universe, but expresses the fundamental creative principle by which the universe achieves coherent complexity. Artistic creation in human culture represents the conscious expression of creative principles that operate unconsciously throughout nature, making art a form of collaboration with cosmic creativity rather than a purely human invention. The relationship between creativity and freedom constitutes one of the most significant aspects of Whitehead's philosophy. Traditional determinism eliminated genuine freedom by reducing all events to the mechanical consequences of prior causes plus universal laws. Traditional libertarianism preserved freedom by exempting certain events from causal determination, but this made free choices arbitrary and disconnected from rational deliberation. Whitehead's solution locates freedom in the creative activity by which each occasion synthesizes its causal inheritance, making freedom compatible with causal influence while avoiding both mechanical determinism and arbitrary randomness. Each actual occasion exercises what Whitehead called self-causation through its creative response to efficient causation from its environment. The occasion cannot avoid being influenced by its past, but it enjoys genuine creativity in determining how to synthesize these influences into its own unique pattern of satisfaction. This creative self-determination operates through final causation, the influence of the occasion's own aim towards satisfaction on its process of synthesis. Final causation does not violate efficient causation, but rather completes it by providing the creative activity through which efficient causes achieve determinate effects. The temporal structure of creativity reveals its relationship to possibility and actuality. Creativity operates in the immediate present by synthesizing actual data inherited from the past with possible forms entertained through conceptual prehension. The past provides the raw material for creative synthesis, but this material must be creatively organized according to possibilities that transcend what has already been actualized. The future exists as the realm of possibilities that may be actualized through creative advance. but these possibilities become actual only through the creative decisions made by individual occasions in their immediate present. This analysis reveals creativity as the principle that mediates between being and becoming, eternity and time, the one and the many. Eternal objects provide the stable forms that give definiteness to creative synthesis, but they achieve concrete existence only through their ingression into actual occasions via creative activity. Actual occasions provide the temporal process through which eternal possibilities become definite actualities. But they achieve this actualization only through creative synthesis guided by eternal forms. Creativity unites the eternal and temporal dimensions of reality without collapsing their distinction, making the eternal relevant to temporal development while preserving its transcendence of any particular temporal actualization. The cosmic scope of creativity extends from the most primitive physical occasions to the highest forms of rational and spiritual experience. This makes the entire universe a creative process rather than a mechanical system, with each level of complexity contributing its own distinctive forms of creative advance to the overall cosmic evolution. Human creativity in art, science, philosophy and spiritual development represents the conscious participation in cosmic creativity rather than the arbitrary imposition of human will on an otherwise uncreative nature. Cultural evolution continues natural evolution through new forms of creative experimentation that transcend biological limitations while remaining grounded in the same fundamental creative principles that operate throughout the natural order. Part 6. The extensive continuum and spatio-temporal relations. The extensive continuum constitutes Whitehead's most technically sophisticated contribution to the philosophy of space and time, providing a metaphysical foundation for Einstein's relativity theories while resolving classical paradoxes about the nature of extension. Traditional concepts of space and time treated them as either absolute containers independent of their contents or as mere relations between substantial objects. Whitehead's alternative grounds spatio-temporal relations in the prehensional activities of actual occasions while maintaining the objective reality of extensive relationships. The extensive continuum emerges from, but is not reducible to, the network of prehensions that bind occasions into a coherent cosmic society. Extension, for Whitehead, refers to the basic relationship of inclusion that enables one region to contain others as proper parts. This relationship of extensive connection provides the foundation for all geometric and topological properties without requiring pre-given spatial or temporal containers. When two actual occasions prehend common elements from their environment, their regions of extension become extensively connected in ways that generate the geometric relationships we observe as spatial and temporal distances, angles and curvatures. Space and time are not given independently of the processes that occupy them, but emerge through the extensive connections that organize these processes into coherent patterns. The method of extensive abstraction allows precise geometric concepts to be derived from the vaguer notion of extensive connection. Starting with the basic relation of inclusion between extensive regions, Whitehead showed how points, lines, planes and other geometric entities could be constructed as limits of converging series of nested regions. A point is not a zero-dimensional location, but rather the class of all converging series of regions that include it as their limit. This construction eliminates the classical problem of how extended objects could be composed of unextended points by revealing points as abstractions from extended processes rather than substantial building blocks from which extension is somehow assembled. The temporal dimension of the extensive continuum requires careful analysis because it differs significantly from spatial extension. Spatial regions can be simultaneously occupied by different aspects of the same occasions. allowing complex patterns of spatial overlap and intersection. Temporal regions exhibit asymmetric relationships of causal influence that prevent the same occasion from occupying multiple temporal positions simultaneously. The temporal structure of the extensive continuum reflects the causal relationships between occasions, with earlier regions providing causal data for later regions, but not vice versa. This causal grounding of temporal order explains why time has a determinate direction from past to future rather than being merely reversible like spatial dimensions. The asymmetry of prehension, whereby occasions can prehend their past but not their future, generates the temporal asymmetry that we experience as the passage of time. Time does not flow like a river, but rather consists in the cumulative creative advance whereby possibilities become actualities through the creative synthesis achieved by actual occasions. The present moment is not a moving point on a pre-existing timeline, but rather the creative edge where the actual past meets the possible future in the immediate process of becoming. Whitehead's analysis of simultaneity provides a metaphysical interpretation of Einstein's relativity of simultaneity that avoids both absolute simultaneity and pure conventionalism. Events are simultaneous when they belong to the same quantum of the extensive continuum, sharing a common extensive region that cannot be subdivided into regions occupied by other occasions. This quantum simultaneity is relative to the reference frame provided by the extensive standpoint of particular occasions or societies of occasions. Different reference frames will define different planes of simultaneity, but these differences reflect genuine features of the extensive continuum rather than merely conventional choices about how to coordinate clocks. The relationship between the extensive continuum and actual occasions illuminates Whitehead's solution to Zeno's paradoxes and other classical puzzles about infinity and continuity. The extensive continuum is infinitely divisible in the sense that any extensive region can in principle be divided into smaller regions without limit. But actual occasions occupy quantum regions that provide the atomic structure necessary to avoid infinite regress in the description of becoming. Each occasion occupies its quantum of the extensive continuum as an indivisible unit, even though that quantum region could in principle be divided by other occasions in different phases of cosmic development. This quantum structure of space-time regions explains how motion and change can occur without requiring the actual traversal of infinitely many spatial positions. An occasion does not move through space, but rather occupies its extensive quantum as a unified standpoint from which it prehends the rest of the universe. What we ordinarily call motion consists in the successive occupation of overlapping extensive regions by different occasions belonging to the same temporal society. The appearance of continuous motion emerges from the discrete succession of occasions, each occupying its own quantum region while inheriting causal influences from predecessors occupying neighbouring regions. The extensive continuum also provides the foundation for understanding physical fields and the propagation of causal influences across spatial distances. Electromagnetic and gravitational fields consist in networks of prehensional relationships that connect occasions across extensive regions according to mathematical laws that describe the intensity and effectiveness of these connections. Field equations describe the patterns of prehensional influence that coordinate the activities of occasions across extended regions of space-time. Mass and energy represent different aspects of the intensive characteristics that actual occasions contribute to their extensive regions, influencing the geometry of the continuum and the patterns of prehension that organize subsequent occasions. The philosophical implications of this analysis extend far beyond technical questions in the philosophy of science to encompass fundamental issues about the nature of individuality and community. The extensive Continuum provides the common medium within which all occasions achieve their individual satisfaction while remaining connected to the cosmic community. Individual creativity and social coordination are made possible by the same extensive relationships that organize occasions into coherent patterns of mutual influence and support. Privacy and publicity, individuality and community, freedom and determinism are all grounded in the extensive relationships that enable occasions to be both unique individuals and cooperative members of larger social wholes. Part 7. Eternal Objects and the Realm of Pure Possibility. Eternal objects constitute Whitehead's version of Plato's forms, providing the element of stable possibility that enables actual occasions to achieve determinate characteristics while transcending mere repetition of past patterns. Unlike Platonic forms, which were conceived as substantial entities existing in a separate realm of being, eternal objects exist only as pure possibilities that achieve concrete reality through their ingression into actual occasions via prehensional relationships. They are eternal not because they exist timelessly in some supernatural domain, but because their relevance to experience transcends any particular temporal actualization. The redness that appears in today's sunset is the same eternal object that appeared in yesterday's rose, even though these actualizations occur in different occasions at different times. The ontological status of eternal objects requires careful analysis to avoid both Platonic reification and nominalist reduction. Eternal objects are not actual entities that exist independently of the occasions that prehend them, but they are also not mere human constructions, arbitrarily imposed on an otherwise formless reality. They represent genuine features of the structure of possibility that constrains and enables the creative advance of the universe without determining the specific ways these possibilities will be actualized. The eternal object of redness defines a specific qualitative possibility that can be actualized in countless different ways, from rose petals to traffic lights to emotional experiences, while retaining its distinctive character across all these diverse actualizations. Whitehead distinguished between different types of eternal objects based on their logical complexity and their relationships to the extensive continuum. Simple eternal objects correspond to basic sensory qualities like colors, sounds, tactile feelings, and emotional tones that can be directly prehended by actual occasions. Complex eternal objects involve patterns of relationship between simple objects, including geometric forms, mathematical structures, logical relationships, and aesthetic harmonies. The most complex eternal objects include propositional forms that specify possible relationships between actual entities and eternal objects, providing the logical structure necessary for abstract thought and symbolic representation. The doctrine of the systematic relatedness of eternal objects explains how possibilities can be both genuinely multiple and genuinely unified. Every eternal object stands in relationships of compatibility and incompatibility with every other eternal object, creating a systematic structure of possibility that constrains the ways eternal objects can be jointly actualized. Redness and greenness are incompatible in the sense that no single prehension can actualize both simultaneously, while redness and roundness are compatible and can be jointly actualized in a single synthesis. This systematic relatedness ensures that the realm of possibility has logical coherence rather than arbitrary chaos, making rational thought and scientific prediction possible while preserving genuine alternatives for creative actualization. The ingression of eternal objects into actual occasions occurs through conceptual prehensions that grasp possibilities independently of their actualization in particular environmental occasions. This conceptual dimension of prehension enables occasions to transcend their immediate causal inheritance by entertaining possibilities that are not exemplified in their actual world. An occasion might conceptually prehend the eternal object of perfect circularity, even though no actual circles in its environment achieve geometric perfection. This capacity for conceptual prehension explains how ideals, mathematical concepts, moral values, and aesthetic forms can influence the creative development of actual occasions without being reducible to the mechanical influences of efficient causation. The relationship between eternal objects and creativity illuminates how genuine novelty can emerge without violating logical constraints. Creativity operates by synthesizing eternal objects in novel combinations that were not previously actualized, generating new forms of order and complexity that transcend past achievements. But this creative synthesis must respect the systematic relationships between eternal objects, ensuring that novel combinations remain logically coherent rather than arbitrary or contradictory. Mathematical discovery provides a clear example of this process, where mathematicians create new theorems by exploring previously unactualized relationships between eternal mathematical objects, according to logical constraints that ensure the coherence and validity of their results. The grades of ingression explain how the same eternal object can be actualized with different degrees of intensity and clarity across different occasions. Simple physical occasions may prehend color eternal objects with minimal intensity and no conscious recognition, contributing to the electromagnetic properties of their behavior without generating conscious color experience. Complex conscious occasions can prehend the same color eternal objects with high intensity and clear consciousness, generating the vivid color experiences that characterize human visual perception. The eternal object remains the same across these different grades of ingression, but its mode of actualization varies dramatically, depending on the complexity and creative capacity of the prehending occasion. This analysis of eternal objects provides Whitehead's solution to the classical problem of universals, the question of how general characteristics can be exemplified by multiple particular instances. Traditional realist solutions treated universals as substantial entities somehow shared by their instances, while nominalist solutions reduced universals to arbitrary human classifications of otherwise unique particulars. Whitehead's alternative locates universals in the eternal objects that can be multiplied and ingressed into different actual occasions, making resemblance an objective feature of reality without requiring substantial universals that exist independently of their particular exemplifications. Multiple occasions can exemplify the same eternal object while remaining distinct individuals, and the same occasion can exemplify multiple eternal objects while maintaining its unique identity. The realm of eternal objects also provides the metaphysical foundation for understanding abstract thinking, mathematical reasoning, and symbolic representation. Human consciousness achieves its distinctive capacity for abstraction through its ability to prehend eternal objects independently of their particular actualizations in environmental occasions. We can think about perfect circles, infinite series, moral ideals, and aesthetic forms, because consciousness can conceptually prehend the relevant eternal objects even when no actual occasions in our environment fully exemplify these abstract possibilities. Language operates through shared conceptual prehensions of eternal objects that enable different individuals to coordinate their responses to common meanings, and thus engage in the cooperative activities that constitute human culture. The temporal relationship between eternal objects and actual occasions explains how the past can influence the future through the mediation of eternal forms. Actual occasions perish immediately upon achieving satisfaction, but the eternal objects they actualized remain available for prehension by future occasions. Cultural transmission occurs through the inheritance of eternal objects that were actualized by past occasions and can be reactualized by future occasions in novel syntheses that preserve traditional forms while introducing creative modifications. This explains how human civilization can exhibit both continuity with its past and creative advance beyond past achievements, maintaining traditional values and insights while exploring new possibilities for their creative actualization. Part 8. The Categorical Scheme and Philosophical Method. Whitehead's philosophical method aimed to construct a categorical scheme of ultimate generality that could explain every aspect of experience without exception. Unlike empirical sciences that focus on particular domains of phenomena, speculative philosophy attempts to discover the generic features that characterize all possible experiences, from quantum events to conscious reflection. This requires a systematic approach that begins with the most general categories and progressively differentiates them to account for the specific characteristics observed at different levels of reality. The categorical scheme provides the logical framework within which all particular facts and theories must find their proper place and explanation. The method of speculative philosophy involves what Whitehead called the flight and the perch, an oscillation between imaginative generalization and careful attention to particular details. The flight represents the creative leap by which the philosopher proposes categorical schemes that transcend the limitations of established conceptual frameworks. The perch represents the critical testing of these speculative proposals against the full range of experience, including scientific observations, aesthetic judgments, moral insights, and religious intuitions. A successful philosophical scheme must be both logically consistent and empirically adequate, explaining all the facts while violating none of the logical requirements for coherent thought. Whitehead organized his categorical scheme into 4 types of categorical elements that operate at different levels of generality and specificity. The category of the ultimate provides the most general principle that applies to every aspect of reality without exception. The categories of existence specify the fundamental types of entities that comprise reality. The categories of explanation articulate the basic principles that govern the relationships between different types of entities. The categorical obligations define the specific constraints that must be satisfied by any adequate description of actual processes. This hierarchical structure ensures both systematic comprehensiveness and logical precision in the development of process metaphysics. The category of the ultimate identifies creativity, actuality, and eternal objects as the 3 fundamental principles that characterize every aspect of reality. Creativity provides the principle of novelty that enables the universe to transcend its past achievements through genuine creative advance. Actuality provides the principle of process that ensures all creativity occurs through the specific activities of determinate actual entities rather than remaining merely abstract or potential. Eternal objects provide the principle of limitation that enables creative processes to achieve determinate characteristics while remaining open to further creative development. The categories of existence enumerate 8 fundamental types of entities: actual entities, prehensions, nexus, subjective forms, eternal objects, propositions, multiplicities, and contrasts. Actual entities are the final real things that exercise creativity through their processes of becoming. Prehensions are the relationships by which actual entities take account of their environment and achieve their determinate satisfaction. Nexus are public matters of fact constituted by networks of prehensional relationships between actual entities. Subjective forms are the emotional and valuational aspects that characterize how prehensions are experienced by prehending subjects. Propositions are hybrid entities that combine actual entities with eternal objects to specify possible relationships that may or may not be actualized. Multiplicities are pure disjunctions of entities considered apart from their relationships. Contrasts are the patterns of unity and opposition that emerge through the creative synthesis of diverse elements. The categories of explanation specify 27 principles that govern the relationships between these different types of entities. These principles include the ontological principle, which requires every reason to be grounded in the activity of some actual entity. The principle of process, which explains how actual entities achieve their determinate characteristics through their genetic development, and the principle of relativity, which ensures that every entity exists only through its relationships with other entities. The categories also include principles governing the intensive aspects of experience, the temporal relationships between past and future, and the logical constraints that ensure the coherence of complex syntheses. Together, these principles provide the logical foundation for understanding how creativity, process, and limitation collaborate to generate the rich complexity of actual experience. The categorical obligations specify 9 requirements that any adequate description of actual processes must satisfy. The category of subjective unity requires that each actual entity achieve a unified synthesis of its diverse prehensions rather than remaining a mere collection of unrelated elements. The category of objective identity ensures that the same eternal object can be ingredient in multiple actual entities while retaining its identical character across different actualizations. The category of objective diversity prevents any actual entity from exemplifying incompatible eternal objects simultaneously. Other obligations govern the transmission of feelings between entities, the integration of physical and mental aspects of experience, and the reversion to alternative possibilities when direct inheritance fails to provide adequate materials for creative synthesis. These categorical obligations ensure that process philosophy can provide precise explanations of particular phenomena while maintaining systematic coherence across all domains of experience. Whitehead's philosophical method also involves what he called the criticism of abstractions, the recognition that all human thinking necessarily involves the selection of certain aspects of experience for attention while ignoring others. The fallacy of misplaced concreteness occurs when we mistake these useful abstractions for complete descriptions of concrete reality. Scientific materialism commits this fallacy by treating the quantitative abstractions useful for physical science as if they exhausted the full reality of nature. Whitehead's alternative involves recognizing abstractions as abstractions while seeking more concrete ways of understanding that can accommodate the full richness of experience without losing the precision and generality that make scientific knowledge possible. The test of systematic coherence requires that every element in the philosophical scheme be logically consistent with every other element, and that the scheme as a whole be capable of explaining its own possibility and limits. A philosophical system cannot exempt itself from its own principles or appeal to external authorities that transcend its systematic scope. Process philosophy must explain how philosophical thinking itself is possible as a form of high-grade prehension that synthesizes conceptual and physical elements into complex propositions about the generic features of reality. The success of this self-referential requirement provides evidence for the adequacy of the categorical scheme, while failure indicates the need for systematic revision or replacement. The method of extensive abstraction, which Whitehead developed in his mathematical work, provides a model for philosophical analysis that derives precise concepts from vague starting points through systematic logical construction. Just as geometric points can be derived as limits of converging series of extended regions, so philosophical categories can be derived as limits of converging series of increasingly precise analyses of experiential data. This method avoids both the dogmatism of assuming precise categories from the beginning and the skepticism of concluding that precision is impossible because experience is inherently vague. Precision emerges through systematic analysis, rather than being given in immediate experience. But this emergent precision captures genuine features of reality rather than imposing arbitrary human constructions. Part 9. God's Primordial and Consequent Natures. Whitehead's philosophical theology presents God as the chief exemplification of metaphysical principles rather than their exception, making divine existence continuous with cosmic processes while preserving the unique characteristics that justify religious attitudes. Traditional theology often portrayed God as wholly other than the world, existing in perfect independence and exercising absolute power over creation. Process theology reveals God as intimately involved in cosmic processes, sharing the fundamental structure of actual experience while exhibiting this structure in a uniquely perfect and complete way. God is the one actual entity that exists necessarily rather than contingently, eternally rather than temporally, and completely rather than partially, but these differences represent matters of degree and scope rather than absolute qualitative distinctions. The distinction between God's primordial and consequent natures reflects the temporal structure of divine experience while avoiding the classical theological problem of divine immutability. God's primordial nature consists in the eternal mental pole, whereby the divine experience envisages the entire realm of eternal objects in their systematic relationships and graduated relevance to possible actualizations. This primordial envisagement provides the initial aim that guides each actual occasion toward forms of satisfaction that maximize intensity of experience while maintaining harmony with environmental conditions. Without this divine ordering of possibilities, occasions would confront chaotic multiplicity rather than systematic alternatives, making creative advance impossible. The primordial nature enables God to function as the principle of limitation that transforms pure creativity from arbitrary chaos into ordered novelty. Creativity by itself would generate random change rather than progressive development, while eternal objects by themselves would remain abstract possibilities rather than relevant alternatives for actual synthesis. God's primordial envisagement of eternal objects according to their degrees of relevance and compatibility provides the valuational structure that enables creativity to generate increasingly complex and harmonious forms of order. This divine valuation does not predetermine particular outcomes, but rather establishes the gradient of possibility that makes some creative choices more attractive than others without eliminating genuine alternatives. God's consequent nature emerges through the divine physical pole, whereby God prehends every actual occasion as it achieves satisfaction and incorporates its achieved value into the growing complexity of divine experience. Unlike finite occasions, which prehend only selected aspects of their environment through positive and negative prehensions, God prehends every occasion completely and sympathetically, preserving its achieved value while integrating it into the comprehensive harmony of divine experience. This means that nothing of value is ever finally lost, since every achievement becomes a permanent contributor to the divine experience even after the originating occasion has perished. Death remains real for finite occasions, but the values they achieve live on in the consequent nature of God and continue to influence future creative advance through God's responsive activity. The relationship between God's primordial and consequent natures exhibits the same dipolar structure that characterizes every actual entity, but in a uniquely perfect form. Finite occasions must achieve satisfaction and perish to make room for successors. But God achieves a continuously growing satisfaction that incorporates new values without losing past achievements. Finite occasions can prehend only limited aspects of their environment, but God's experience is comprehensive enough to prehend every occasion fully while maintaining the systematic harmony necessary for unified experience. Finite occasions must choose between incompatible alternatives, but God's experience is rich enough to preserve all compatible values while maintaining clear distinctions between genuine alternatives. This analysis reveals God as both supremely relative and supremely absolute in ways that transcend the classical theological debate between these seemingly opposed attributes. God is supremely relative because the divine experience includes sympathetic prehensions of every finite experience as it occurs, making God immediately responsive to every joy and suffering in the universe. God is supremely absolute because this responsive experience maintains perfect internal harmony and comprehensive scope that cannot be threatened or destroyed by any finite developments. God changes through the incorporation of new experiences, but never changes in the sense of losing achieved values or compromising the systematic perfection of divine experience. The temporal relationship between God and the world exhibits mutual immanence without mutual dependence in ways that preserve both divine perfection and cosmic creativity. God influences the world through the provision of initial aims that lure each occasion toward forms of satisfaction that contribute optimally to cosmic harmony and intensity. But these initial aims operate through persuasion rather than coercion, respecting the creative freedom of each occasion to choose its own response to divine influence. The world influences God through the contribution of achieved values to the divine experience, enriching the consequent nature without compromising the eternal perfection of the primordial nature. This mutual interaction explains how prayer and worship can be meaningful without reducing God to a finite agent subject to external manipulation. Prayer does not change God's eternal purposes, but can influence God's temporal strategies for achieving these purposes through the changed circumstances that prayer introduces into the world. Worship expresses appropriate recognition of God's supreme reality and value, while participating in the cosmic process through which finite achievements contribute to divine satisfaction. Religious experience becomes a form of conscious cooperation with divine creativity rather than submissive obedience to arbitrary divine commands. The problem of divine knowledge receives sophisticated treatment through Whitehead's analysis of how God can know contingent truths without compromising divine perfection. God's primordial nature knows all eternal objects and their systematic relationships with perfect clarity and completeness. God's consequent nature knows all actual occasions as they achieve satisfaction, but this knowledge grows through the temporal process of cosmic development rather than being given eternally and completely. Divine omniscience consists in knowing everything that can be definitely known while recognizing that some aspects of the future remain genuinely open and cannot be known even by perfect intelligence until they are determined through the creative choices of finite occasions. This temporal dimension of divine knowledge provides Whitehead's solution to the classical problem of reconciling divine foreknowledge with human freedom. God knows all past events completely and all future possibilities systematically, but God cannot know which possibilities will be actualized because these decisions remain open until they are made through the creative activity of finite occasions. Divine knowledge includes perfect understanding of the probabilities and tendencies that influence future developments, but it does not include determinate knowledge of outcomes that depend on decisions not yet made. This preserves both divine omniscience and cosmic creativity by distinguishing between different types of knowledge appropriate to different temporal relationships. Part 10. The problem of evil and divine persuasion. The existence of evil presents perhaps the greatest challenge to any philosophical theology that affirms both divine goodness and divine power. Traditional solutions either limited divine power to preserve divine goodness or compromised divine goodness to preserve divine power, but neither alternative proved satisfactory to religious experience or rational analysis. Whitehead's process theology offers a third alternative that reconceives divine power as persuasive rather than coercive, making God responsible for the possibility of good without being responsible for the actuality of evil. This solution requires careful analysis of different types of evil and their relationship to the fundamental structure of creative process. Whitehead distinguished between physical evil, which involves the frustration of life and experience, and moral evil, which involves the deliberate choice of destructive alternatives by conscious agents. Physical evil includes natural disasters, disease, death, and all forms of suffering that result from the clash between incompatible forms of order rather than from conscious malice. These evils are inevitable consequences of a universe that achieves value through creative risk rather than mechanical safety. Without the possibility of discord and destruction, there could be no possibility of harmony and creation, because creativity requires the synthesis of diverse elements that may prove incompatible. The metaphysical necessity of physical evil emerges from the structure of creativity itself. Every actual occasion must choose between alternative possibilities, and these choices necessarily exclude some potential values to actualize others. The richness and intensity of experience depend on the synthesis of contrasting elements, but such synthesis always risks discord when the contrasts prove too great for harmonious integration. Life achieves its distinctive values through forms of order that are inherently unstable and vulnerable to environmental changes that can destroy the delicate balance necessary for vital activity. God's relationship to physical evil involves neither direct causation nor arbitrary permission, but rather the provision of optimal possibilities within constraints imposed by past decisions and metaphysical necessities. Each occasion receives from God an initial aim toward the form of satisfaction that would contribute maximally to both its own fulfillment and cosmic harmony under existing circumstances. But these circumstances often include conflicting demands that make perfect solutions impossible, forcing occasions to choose between incompatible goods or competing forms of order. God cannot eliminate these tragic choices without eliminating the creative freedom that makes genuine value possible, but divine influence consistently operates toward minimizing unnecessary suffering and maximizing realizable harmony. Moral evil presents more complex challenges because it involves the conscious rejection of better alternatives in favor of worse ones. Process theology locates the source of moral evil in the creative freedom that enables conscious agents to choose their own responses to divine aims rather than being mechanically determined by them. This freedom makes moral responsibility possible by ensuring that good and evil choices flow from genuine decisions rather than external compulsion. But it also makes moral evil inevitable in any universe containing free agents. God cannot eliminate moral evil without eliminating the freedom that makes moral goodness meaningful and valuable. The analysis of sin and redemption within process theology emphasizes transformation rather than punishment as the primary divine response to moral evil. Sin consists in the choice of narrow self-interest over broader forms of sympathy and harmony that would contribute more effectively to cosmic value. Such choices damage both the sinner and the larger community by reducing the intensity and scope of shared experience. Divine redemption operates through the continuous provision of new opportunities for broader sympathy and more harmonious integration, enabling finite agents to transcend past failures through creative advance toward more inclusive forms of value. The temporal structure of redemption reflects the irreversible nature of temporal process while maintaining hope for creative transformation of past failures. What has been done cannot be undone, but its significance can be transformed through new contexts that reveal previously hidden possibilities for value and meaning. Tragic experiences can become sources of wisdom and compassion that enable deeper forms of sympathy and more effective responses to future challenges. Even moral failures can contribute to the education of free agents who learn through experience to make better choices and more inclusive syntheses. The eschatological dimension of Whitehead's theology involves the preservation and completion of temporal values in the consequent nature of God rather than their replacement by eternal alternatives. Traditional eschatology often portrayed eternal life as compensation for temporal suffering, suggesting that finite achievements were ultimately insignificant compared to infinite rewards. Process eschatology treats temporal achievements as genuinely contributory to eternal value, making finite life intrinsically meaningful rather than merely instrumentally valuable. Death remains real and tragic because it terminates the creative possibilities available to finite occasions. But the values achieved through finite creativity become permanent contributions to divine experience and continue to influence future cosmic development. This understanding of divine preservation transforms the meaning of individual death and cosmic extinction. Personal death involves the cessation of the dominant society of occasions that constitutes an individual personality, but the values achieved through that personality become permanently ingredient in divine experience. The eventual heat death of the universe would terminate the possibility of further creative advance within this cosmic epoch, but the values achieved throughout cosmic evolution would remain forever as contributions to divine satisfaction. Neither individual nor cosmic mortality can destroy achieved value, though they can prevent further creative advance along particular lines of development. The theodicy implicit in this analysis justifies divine permission of evil through the greater good that emerges from creative process despite its tragic dimensions. A universe containing genuine creativity, freedom, love and beauty requires the risks that make suffering, conflict, failure and death possible. God cannot create beings capable of love without creating beings capable of hatred, or beings capable of creative achievement without creating beings capable of destructive failure. The divine choice is not between good and evil, but between a universe containing both good and evil and no universe at all. The process theology maintains that existence, with its mixture of joy and suffering, is preferable to non-existence, and that the goods achievable through creative process justify the evils that necessarily accompany them. This judgment can only be validated through the total experience that includes both temporal process and its eternal preservation in divine experience, making the ultimate assessment of cosmic value a matter of religious faith rather than philosophical demonstration. Part 11. The Philosophy of Science and the Critique of Scientific Materialism. Whitehead's philosophy of science emerged from his recognition that the mechanistic materialism underlying classical physics had become philosophically untenable in light of 20th century developments in quantum mechanics and relativity theory. The scientific worldview, inherited from the 17th century, treated nature as a collection of inert particles moving according to mathematical laws in absolute space and time. This mechanistic picture successfully predicted many observable phenomena, but left consciousness, purpose, value and creativity as inexplicable additions to an otherwise purely material universe. Whitehead's alternative grounded scientific knowledge in the experiential relationships between actual occasions, while preserving the mathematical precision and predictive power that made science so successful. The bifurcation of nature represents one of the most serious errors in classical scientific thinking. This bifurcation divided reality into primary qualities that exist objectively in nature and secondary qualities that exist only subjectively in conscious experience. Colours, sounds, tastes and emotional feelings were relegated to the mental realm, while only mathematical properties like mass, velocity and spatial extension were granted objective existence in the physical world. This division made the relationship between mind and nature completely mysterious, while impoverishing our understanding of natural processes by reducing them to purely quantitative abstractions. Whitehead's critique revealed that the scientific abstractions useful for mathematical physics were being mistaken for complete descriptions of concrete reality. The fallacy of misplaced concreteness led scientists to treat their highly selective mathematical descriptions as if they captured everything real about nature. But mathematical physics necessarily abstracts from the full richness of natural processes to focus on those aspects that can be precisely measured and mathematically related. What gets left out are the qualitative, experiential and creative dimensions that make nature a living process rather than a dead mechanism. The quantum revolution in 20th century physics provided empirical support for many aspects of Whitehead's process critique. Quantum mechanics revealed that fundamental particles do not have definite properties independent of measurement interactions, challenging the classical assumption that nature consists of substantial objects with inherent characteristics. The wave-particle duality suggested that electrons and photons exhibit both continuous and discontinuous aspects, supporting Whitehead's claim that nature involves both extensive relationships and atomic occasions. Quantum entanglement demonstrated that spatially separated particles can exhibit correlations that cannot be explained by local mechanical causation, pointing toward the kind of direct prehensional relationships that process philosophy requires. Einstein's relativity theories undermined classical assumptions about absolute space and time while revealing the fundamental role of perspective and relationship in physical description. The relativity of simultaneity showed that the division between past, present and future depends on the reference frame of the observer, supporting Whitehead's claim that temporal relationships are grounded in the extensive standpoints of actual occasions. The curvature of space-time by mass-energy suggested that geometric relationships are influenced by the processes they contain rather than providing an independent container for these processes. General relativity's field equations describe patterns of relationship and influence that closely resemble the networks of prehension that organize occasions into cosmic societies. Whitehead's philosophy of organism provides a metaphysical framework that can accommodate these revolutionary scientific developments while preserving the mathematical rigor and predictive success of physical science. Instead of treating mathematical descriptions as complete accounts of reality, process philosophy recognizes them as abstract selections from the full concreteness of natural processes. The equations of quantum mechanics describe patterns of probability that reflect the creative choices available to actual occasions, while relativity equations describe the extensive relationships that coordinate these choices into macroscopic regularities. Both quantum indeterminacy and relativistic relationships become comprehensible when grounded in the experiential activities of actual occasions rather than treated as mysterious features of purely material substances. The emergence of complexity theory and system science in the late 20th century has provided additional support for organismic approaches to natural science. Complex adaptive systems exhibit emergent properties that cannot be reduced to the simple summation of their component parts, supporting Whitehead's claim that societies of occasions can achieve forms of order that transcend their individual constituents. Non-linear dynamics and chaos theory reveal how small changes in initial conditions can produce dramatically different outcomes, reflecting the creative freedom that process philosophy locates in every actual occasion. Network theory describes the complex patterns of relationship and influence that bind diverse elements into functional wholes, paralleling the prehensional relationships that organize occasions into societies. Whitehead's analysis of scientific method emphasizes the creative and selective dimensions that mechanistic accounts typically ignore or minimize. Scientific observation involves not passive reception of external data, but active prehensional synthesis that selects certain aspects of natural processes for attention while ignoring others. Theoretical construction requires conceptual prehensions that entertain mathematical possibilities not directly exemplified in observational data, enabling scientists to discover general patterns that transcend particular measurements. Experimental design involves the creative arrangement of environmental conditions that can reveal aspects of natural processes not evident under ordinary circumstances. The role of mathematics in scientific description requires careful analysis to avoid both Platonic reification and nominalist reduction. Mathematical entities like numbers, geometric forms, and algebraic structures are eternal objects that can be multiplied and ingressed into different natural processes without losing their systematic relationships. The mathematical description of natural phenomena reveals genuine patterns of order and relationship rather than arbitrary human constructions. But these patterns exist as aspects of the processes they organize rather than as independent substantial entities. The effectiveness of mathematics in natural science reflects the fact that actual occasions achieve their definiteness through relationships that exhibit mathematical characteristics, making mathematical description a form of abstract insight into concrete processes rather than mere conventional symbolism. The problem of scientific reductionism receives sophisticated treatment through Whitehead's analysis of levels of explanation and emergence. Higher-level phenomena like biological organisms and conscious experiences cannot be reduced to simple collections of lower-level physical processes because they exhibit emergent forms of order that require their own appropriate descriptions. But these emergent properties remain grounded in the activities of actual occasions that follow the same fundamental principles operating at physical levels, avoiding both reductionist elimination of higher levels and dualist separation of different ontological realms. Scientific explanation must recognize both the continuity of basic principles across all levels and the genuine novelty that emerges through increasingly complex forms of organization. The implications of process philosophy for future scientific development include greater attention to temporal process, relationship, and creativity in natural description. Instead of seeking timeless laws governing eternal substances, science might focus on understanding the temporal patterns through which natural processes achieve stability and generate novelty. Instead of analyzing complex systems into independent parts, scientific method might emphasize the relational networks through which diverse elements collaborate to create emergent wholes. Instead of eliminating purpose and value from natural description, scientific understanding might explore the forms of primitive purposiveness and valuation that operate even at physical levels. These developments would not eliminate the mathematical rigor and predictive power that make science valuable, but they would integrate scientific knowledge into a more comprehensive understanding that includes the experiential and creative dimensions of natural process. Science would become a form of abstract insight into the concrete fullness of nature rather than a complete substitute for direct experiential engagement with natural processes. Part 12. Perception, Symbolism and the Theory of Knowledge. Whitehead's epistemology revolutionizes traditional theories of knowledge by grounding cognitive processes in the same prehensional activities that characterize all forms of experience. Instead of beginning with a knowing subject that somehow gains access to independent objects, process epistemology starts with the prehensional relationships through which subjects and objects co-emerge in the immediate activities of actual occasions. Knowledge becomes a specialized form of prehension rather than a mysterious bridging of an ontological gap between mind and world. This eliminates the classical epistemological problems that plagued both empiricist and rationalist traditions, while providing a more adequate account of how conscious experience achieves cognitive content. The distinction between perception in the mode of causal efficacy and perception in the mode of presentational immediacy illuminates the complex temporal structure of human knowledge. Causal efficacy refers to our direct prehension of past actual occasions that causally influence our present experience, providing the massive background of inherited feelings that constitute our bodily existence. This form of perception operates largely below the threshold of consciousness, but provides the causal grounding for all conscious experience in the actual processes of the natural world. Presentational immediacy refers to our conscious projection of conceptual forms onto regions of the contemporary world, creating the vivid sense data that constitute the familiar objects of ordinary perception. The relationship between these two modes of perception explains both the cognitive value and the potential deceptiveness of conscious experience. Presentational immediacy provides clear and distinct sense data that can be precisely analyzed and mathematically described, making possible the exact measurements that enable scientific prediction and technological control. But these clear sense data are largely contemporary with the perceiver rather than causally related to him, making them projective rather than directly informative about their apparent locations. The red colour you see apparently located on the rose is actually a conceptual feeling projected onto the contemporary region occupied by the rose, rather than a direct prehension of redness as it exists in the rose itself. Causal efficacy provides reliable information about the actual causal relationships that bind the perceiver to his environment, but this information remains largely vague and below the level of clear consciousness. Your body directly prehends the electromagnetic and chemical influences that constitute its interactions with environmental objects, providing accurate knowledge of these causal relationships. But this knowledge remains primitive and undifferentiated until it is supplemented by the conceptual elaborations that create the clear objects of presentational immediacy. The combination of causal efficacy with presentational immediacy generates the complex hybrid perceptions that constitute ordinary conscious experience of a meaningful world. Symbolic reference represents the sophisticated cognitive process through which the vague but reliable information from causal efficacy is integrated with the clear but projective content of presentational immediacy. This process enables conscious experience to refer the clear sense data to their proper causal sources, creating the stable object world that provides the foundation for practical action and theoretical knowledge. When symbolic reference operates successfully, we perceive red roses rather than experiencing disconnected colour sensations and bodily feelings, enabling us to navigate our environment effectively and predict the consequences of our actions. When symbolic reference operates unsuccessfully, we experience various forms of perceptual error, from simple optical illusions to complex hallucinations. The analysis of symbolic reference reveals the fundamentally creative and interpretive character of all conscious perception. What we ordinarily take to be passive reception of external information actually involves active synthesis of diverse prehensions according to conceptual patterns that may or may not correspond accurately to environmental conditions. Perception is always interpretation, involving creative judgments about how to integrate causal influences with conceptual possibilities to generate meaningful experience of a structured world. This makes perceptual error inevitable, while explaining how perceptual learning and correction can occur through improved forms of symbolic reference that achieve better integration between causal and conceptual components. The temporal structure of perception illuminates the relationship between memory, immediate awareness, and anticipation in conscious experience. What we call the immediate present actually involves a complex synthesis of prehensions, spanning a brief duration that includes aspects of the immediate past, present, and anticipated future. Memory provides the inherited patterns of symbolic reference that enable new experiences to be integrated into coherent narratives of personal and environmental development. Anticipation involves the projection of these inherited patterns onto future possibilities, generating expectations that guide practical action while remaining open to creative modification through unexpected developments. Whitehead's analysis of language and symbolism extends beyond perception to encompass all forms of cultural communication and abstract thinking. Language operates through shared conceptual prehensions that enable different individuals to entertain the same eternal objects and thus coordinate their responses to common meanings. Linguistic symbols achieve their referential function through conventional associations between sensory patterns and conceptual contents. But these conventions must be grounded in genuine similarities between the experiences of different language users. Cultural transmission occurs through the inheritance of symbolic patterns that preserve valuable insights while enabling creative modifications that adapt traditional wisdom to new circumstances. The problem of truth receives sophisticated treatment through Whitehead's analysis of propositions as hybrid entities that combine actual entities with eternal objects to specify possible states of affairs. Propositions are not merely human linguistic constructions, but represent genuine features of reality that can be entertained by any sufficiently complex occasions through conceptual prehension. Truth consists in the conformity between propositions and the actual facts they purport to describe. But this conformity involves degrees of accuracy and relevance rather than simple correspondence between static entities. Even false propositions can contribute to the creative advance of experience by suggesting alternative possibilities that stimulate imagination and enable more comprehensive syntheses than would be possible through simple reproduction of actual facts. The cognitive value of error and illusion becomes comprehensible through this analysis of propositional experience. Perceptual errors often result from the entertainment of propositions that do not accurately describe their apparent subject matters, but these false propositions can reveal important truths about the creative processes that generate conscious experience. Optical illusions teach us about the interpretive mechanisms through which visual perception constructs stable objects from fluctuating sensory data. Hallucinations reveal the creative freedom that consciousness exercises in synthesizing inherited prehensions with conceptual possibilities, even when this synthesis fails to achieve accurate symbolic reference to environmental conditions. The epistemological implications of process philosophy extend to scientific knowledge, artistic creation, moral insight, and religious experience. Scientific theories represent high-level propositions that achieve their cognitive value through their capacity to coordinate diverse observational data into systematic patterns that enable prediction and control. Artistic works embody complex propositions about possible forms of aesthetic experience, communicating insights about beauty, meaning, and value that cannot be reduced to literal propositional statements. Moral principles express propositions about optimal forms of interpersonal relationship and social organization, requiring creative application to particular circumstances rather than mechanical implementation of universal rules. Religious symbols articulate propositions about ultimate reality and meaning that transcend the scope of empirical observation while remaining grounded in the experiential activities that constitute finite existence. All forms of knowledge involve the same fundamental process of creative synthesis between inherited prehensions and conceptual possibilities. But they differ in their complexity, scope, and criteria for evaluation. Part 13. The Doctrine of Propositions and Truth. Propositions occupy a unique position in Whitehead's ontology as hybrid entities that mediate between the actuality of completed occasions and the pure possibility of eternal objects. Unlike purely actual entities that have achieved determinate satisfaction, or purely possible eternal objects that remain abstract until actualized, Propositions specify determinate possibilities for actual entities by combining particular subjects with predicative patterns. They represent what might be the case about actual entities, whether or not these possibilities are in fact realized. This hybrid character enables propositions to function as the logical subjects of belief, doubt, judgment, and inference, while remaining grounded in the actual processes that constitute experience. The logical structure of propositions involves what Whitehead called the logical subjects and the predicative pattern. The logical subjects consist of actual entities about which the proposition makes assertions, while the predicative pattern consists of eternal objects that specify possible characteristics or relationships these entities might exemplify. The proposition that this rose is red involves the actual entity constituting the rose as logical subject and the eternal object of redness as part of the predicative pattern. But propositions can involve much more complex structures, including multiple logical subjects, relational predicative patterns, and nested propositional contents that specify possibilities about other possibilities. The entertainment of propositions by actual occasions occurs through intellectual prehensions that combine physical prehensions of the logical subjects with conceptual prehensions of the predicative pattern. This entertainment does not require conscious awareness or linguistic articulation, but represents a fundamental form of cognitive activity that operates at many levels of complexity. Even relatively simple occasions can entertain elementary propositions about their environment through their integration of physical and conceptual prehensions, though they lack the symbolic sophistication necessary for abstract propositional thinking. Human consciousness achieves its distinctive cognitive capacity through its ability to entertain complex propositions involving multiple levels of abstraction and systematic logical relationships. The distinction between true and false propositions depends on their conformity to the actual facts they purport to describe, but this conformity involves degrees of accuracy and completeness rather than simple binary alternatives. A proposition is true insofar as the logical subjects actually exemplify the predicative pattern specified by the proposition, but most propositions achieve only partial truth because they abstract from the full complexity of their subjects. The proposition that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius is true under standard atmospheric pressure, but false under different pressure conditions, illustrating how propositional truth depends on the specification of relevant circumstances. Even false propositions can achieve partial truth by capturing some aspects of their subjects while misrepresenting others, making the evaluation of propositional accuracy a matter of degree rather than absolute judgment. The cognitive importance of false propositions challenges traditional correspondence theories that treat truth as the sole criterion of propositional value. Propositions contribute to the creative advance of experience not only through their truth or falsity, but also through their capacity to stimulate imagination, suggest alternative possibilities, and enable more comprehensive syntheses than would be possible through simple reproduction of actual facts. Scientific hypotheses often begin as false or partially true propositions that guide investigation toward more adequate theories, while artistic works embody propositions about possible experiences that cannot be evaluated simply in terms of factual correspondence. Even logical and mathematical propositions achieve their value through their systematic relationships rather than through their correspondence to independently existing abstract objects. The problem of necessary truth receives sophisticated treatment through Whitehead's analysis of the relationships between eternal objects and the propositions that involve them. Logical truths, like the principle of non-contradiction, achieve their necessity through the systematic relationships that obtain between eternal objects independently of their particular actualizations. Mathematical truths express relationships between mathematical eternal objects that constrain all possible actualizations without determining particular outcomes. But even necessary truths require propositional entertainment by actual occasions to become effective in guiding thought and action, making their necessity dependent on their relevance to actual processes rather than their existence in some independent realm of abstract entities. The doctrine of propositions provides Whitehead's analysis of judgment, inference, and rational thought as specialized forms of prehensional activity. Judgment involves the evaluation of propositions according to criteria of truth, relevance, and systematic coherence, requiring complex syntheses of diverse prehensions that integrate perceptual data with conceptual patterns. Inference involves the entertainment of propositions that are logically related to previously entertained propositions, enabling conscious experience to explore the systematic implications of accepted beliefs. Rational thought achieves its distinctive character through its capacity to entertain abstract propositions that transcend immediate environmental conditions while remaining grounded in the experiential activities that constitute conscious existence. The relationship between propositions and emotions reveals the evaluative dimension that characterizes all cognitive activity. The entertainment of propositions is always accompanied by subjective forms that express the emotional response of the entertaining subject to the propositional content. These emotional responses provide immediate evaluations of the proposition's relevance, importance, and aesthetic quality, guiding the subject's decisions about which propositions deserve further attention and development. Intellectual emotions like curiosity, satisfaction, doubt, and conviction play essential roles in directing the course of rational inquiry and creative thought, making cognition an inherently valuational activity rather than merely mechanical information processing. The social dimension of propositional experience involves the communication and criticism of propositions within communities of inquiry. Language enables the articulation and sharing of propositional content, allowing different individuals to entertain the same propositions and thus coordinate their cognitive activities toward common goals. Cultural traditions preserve valuable propositions across generations while enabling creative modifications that adapt inherited insights to new circumstances and challenges. Scientific communities develop systematic procedures for testing and revising propositional claims, while artistic traditions explore new forms of propositional expression that expand the range of human experience and understanding. The metaphysical status of propositions as genuine features of reality, rather than mere human constructions, distinguishes Whitehead's theory from purely linguistic or psychological accounts of propositional content. Propositions exist wherever actual entities achieve sufficient complexity to integrate physical and conceptual prehensions into hybrid forms that specify possibilities for their subjects. Human language articulates propositional contents that exist independently of linguistic expression, though linguistic articulation enables much more complex and systematic forms of propositional development than would otherwise be possible. This makes propositional logic a form of abstract insight into the actual structure of cognitive processes, rather than merely conventional rules for manipulating arbitrary symbols. The laws of logic describe genuine features of how propositions can be coherently combined and systematically related, reflecting the rational structure that emerges through the creative advance of complex cognitive processes. Truth, falsity, logical consistency, and inferential validity are objective characteristics of propositional relationships rather than subjective projections of human preferences onto otherwise arbitrary symbolic systems. Part 14. Aesthetic Experience and the Theory of Beauty. Beauty occupies a central position in Whitehead's philosophy as both a fundamental cosmic principle and the ultimate criterion for evaluating the success of creative synthesis. Unlike traditional approaches that treat aesthetics as a specialized human response to particular objects, process philosophy locates aesthetic experience in the basic structure of every actual occasion's achievement of satisfaction through creative prehension. Every occasion seeks to achieve the maximum intensity of experience compatible with the harmonious integration of its diverse prehensions, making aesthetic satisfaction the fundamental goal of all creative activity. This universalization of aesthetic experience connects human artistic creation with the creative processes operating throughout nature, while preserving the distinctive characteristics that emerge at higher levels of complexity. The essential structure of aesthetic experience involves the creative synthesis of complexity and simplicity, contrast and compatibility, novelty and tradition in forms that achieve maximum intensity without sacrificing coherent unity. Complexity provides the richness of content that makes experience interesting and valuable, but excessive complexity can overwhelm the integrative capacities of the experiencing subject, resulting in chaos rather than aesthetic satisfaction. Simplicity provides the unity necessary for coherent experience, but excessive simplicity eliminates the contrasts that generate intensity, resulting in boring triviality rather than aesthetic achievement. Successful aesthetic synthesis balances these competing demands by discovering forms of order that can accommodate the maximum compatible complexity while maintaining sufficient unity to generate satisfying experience. The relationship between contrast and compatibility illuminates how aesthetic experience can incorporate opposition and conflict without dissolving into incoherence. Aesthetic contrasts involve differences that enhance rather than destroy each other, like the interplay between warm and cool colours in a painting or the tension between dissonance and resolution in music. These contrasts generate the dynamic tension that makes aesthetic experience vivid and memorable, while contributing to overall patterns of harmony that integrate diverse elements into satisfying wholes. The successful management of aesthetic contrast requires what Whitehead called the art of life, the creative skill that discovers how apparent oppositions can be transformed into mutually enhancing relationships. The temporal dimension of aesthetic experience involves the creative integration of inherited patterns with novel possibilities in ways that preserve valuable traditions while enabling progressive development. Aesthetic novelty cannot be arbitrary innovation that ignores past achievements, because such innovation would lack the systematic relationships necessary for coherent experience. But aesthetic tradition cannot be mere mechanical repetition of established patterns, because such repetition eliminates the creative freedom that generates aesthetic intensity. Successful aesthetic creation synthesizes traditional forms with innovative elements in ways that reveal new possibilities for both, while achieving higher levels of complexity and integration than either could accomplish independently. Whitehead's analysis of art as the creative expression of aesthetic principles operating throughout nature challenges both formalist and expressionist theories of artistic value. Formalist theories emphasize the structural properties of artistic works while neglecting their experiential and communicative dimensions, reducing art to mere decoration or technical exercise. Expressionist theories emphasize the personal emotions of artists while neglecting the objective aesthetic principles that make artistic communication possible, reducing art to mere autobiography or therapy. Process aesthetics recognizes both the objective aesthetic principles that operate throughout nature and the subjective creative activity through which artists discover and articulate new possibilities for aesthetic experience. The concept of massive aesthetic experience explains how great artistic works can achieve universal appeal despite their particular cultural origins and individual characteristics. Such works embody aesthetic principles and relationships that transcend their immediate circumstances while remaining concretely grounded in specific materials, techniques, and cultural contexts. They achieve what Whitehead called width of relevance by discovering forms of aesthetic order that can be appreciated across diverse cultural backgrounds and historical periods without losing their distinctive character. This explains why works like the Parthenon, the plays of Shakespeare, or the music of Bach continue to generate aesthetic satisfaction for audiences far removed from their original contexts while retaining their specific cultural meanings and historical significance. The relationship between aesthetic experience and moral value reveals the evaluative dimension that characterizes all forms of creative synthesis. Aesthetic decisions about what forms of order are most satisfying necessarily involve judgments about what kinds of experience are most valuable and worth pursuing. These judgments cannot be reduced to mere personal preferences because they involve objective relationships between different possibilities for creative synthesis, but they also cannot be reduced to mechanical applications of universal rules because they require creative adaptation to particular circumstances. The cultivation of aesthetic sensitivity becomes a form of moral education that develops the capacity to recognize and appreciate the forms of value that emerge through creative synthesis at all levels of experience. The social dimension of aesthetic experience involves the creation and maintenance of cultural traditions that preserve and develop aesthetic insights across generations of creative practitioners. Artistic traditions provide the accumulated wisdom about aesthetic possibilities that enables individual artists to achieve levels of sophistication and depth that would be impossible without cultural support and guidance. But these traditions remain vital only through the creative contributions of individuals who discover new possibilities for aesthetic expression while respecting the systematic principles that make aesthetic communication possible. The tension between individual creativity and cultural tradition generates the dynamic development that characterizes all living aesthetic traditions while avoiding both sterile conservatism and arbitrary innovation. The critique of modern civilization from an aesthetic perspective reveals how technological and economic developments can either enhance or diminish the possibilities for aesthetic experience. Industrialization and mass production can democratize access to aesthetic objects while destroying the craft traditions that developed sophisticated understanding of aesthetic principles through direct, practical engagement with materials and techniques. Modern communication technologies can make diverse aesthetic traditions available to global audiences, while reducing aesthetic experience to passive consumption of standardized products designed for maximum commercial appeal rather than maximum aesthetic value. The challenge for contemporary civilization involves discovering how technological capabilities can be directed toward enhancing, rather than diminishing, the aesthetic dimensions of human experience and natural environment. The educational implications of process aesthetics emphasize the cultivation of aesthetic sensitivity as fundamental to all forms of creative and rational development. Education should aim not merely at the transmission of factual information or technical skills, but at the development of the aesthetic judgment necessary to recognize what forms of knowledge and skill are most valuable and how they can be creatively integrated into satisfying patterns of personal and social life. This requires direct engagement with aesthetic objects and creative practices that develop sensitivity to the subtle relationships between form and content, tradition and innovation, simplicity and complexity that characterize all successful creative synthesis. Aesthetic education becomes preparation for the art of life itself. The ongoing creative challenge of discovering how to integrate diverse experiences and opportunities into personally satisfying and socially valuable patterns of activity. Without aesthetic sensitivity, both individual and social development become merely mechanical accumulation of disconnected achievements rather than creative synthesis of valuable experiences into meaningful and beautiful forms of life. The aesthetic dimension of experience provides the ultimate criterion for evaluating the success of both personal development and social progress toward more valuable and satisfying forms of human civilization. Part 15. Ethics, Value Theory and Moral Philosophy. Whitehead's approach to ethics emerges naturally from his metaphysics of creative process, grounding moral obligations in the fundamental structure of reality rather than deriving them from external commands or arbitrary conventions. Every actual occasion seeks to maximize the intensity of its own experience while contributing to the creative possibilities available to future occasions, making self-realization and social contribution inherently interconnected rather than potentially conflicting goals. This eliminates the traditional opposition between egoistic and altruistic ethics by revealing that genuine self-fulfillment requires contributing to the broader communities that make individual development possible. Moral philosophy becomes the systematic exploration of how individuals and societies can organize their activities to maximize the creative possibilities available to all members of the cosmic community. The ontological foundation of value lies in the creative activity through which actual occasions achieve satisfaction by synthesizing diverse prehensions into novel unities. Value is not accidentally superimposed on an otherwise value-neutral reality, but emerges wherever creative synthesis generates forms of experience that transcend their constituent elements. Every occasion exercises primitive forms of valuation through its selective prehensions and creative decisions, preferring some possibilities over others according to their relevance to its own aesthetic satisfaction. Higher forms of valuation emerge through increasingly complex syntheses that can appreciate multiple perspectives simultaneously and coordinate diverse interests into harmonious patterns of mutual enhancement. The relationship between individual and social values reflects the social nature of reality itself rather than representing an external constraint on individual freedom. Individual occasions achieve their distinctive characteristics only through their relationships with the social environments that provide the materials and patterns for their creative synthesis. But social environments exist only through the creative contributions of the individual occasions that constitute them, making individual creativity essential to social vitality. This reciprocal relationship means that genuine individual fulfillment requires contributing to social environments that can support the creative development of all their members, while healthy social environments require space for individual creativity and innovation. Whitehead's analysis of moral progress emphasizes the expansion of sympathetic understanding that enables individuals and communities to appreciate increasingly diverse perspectives and integrate them into more inclusive patterns of mutual support. Primitive forms of morality focus on the immediate family or tribal group while treating outsiders as potential threats or resources for exploitation. More developed forms of morality extend sympathetic concern to large communities, eventually embracing all human beings as deserving moral consideration, regardless of their particular cultural or biological characteristics. The most advanced forms of moral development extend this sympathetic concern to non-human forms of life and even to the cosmic process itself, recognizing the interdependence that connects all forms of creative activity. The concept of the art of life provides Whitehead's alternative to both rigid moral rules and arbitrary relativism in ethical decision-making. Moral situations typically involve conflicts between legitimate but incompatible values that cannot be resolved through mechanical application of universal principles. The art of life involves the creative discovery of how these competing values can be harmonized through innovative syntheses that preserve what is most valuable in each while transcending their apparent opposition. This requires aesthetic sensitivity to the subtle relationships between different possibilities and creative courage to experiment with novel approaches that might achieve more inclusive forms of value than conventional alternatives. The temporal structure of moral responsibility reflects the irreversible nature of creative decisions while maintaining hope for redemptive transformation of past failures. Every moral choice contributes permanently to the character of the agent and the environment, making moral decisions genuinely consequential rather than merely conventional or arbitrary. But the consequences of moral choices are not mechanically determined by the choices themselves, because these consequences depend on how future occasions choose to respond to and build upon inherited moral achievements or failures. This makes moral responsibility real and serious while avoiding both fatalistic determinism and paralyzing guilt about past mistakes that cannot be undone but can be creatively transcended. The problem of evil receives ethical analysis through Whitehead's distinction between necessary and unnecessary forms of suffering and conflict. Some forms of suffering are inevitable consequences of living in a universe where creative advance requires risk and where different forms of value may prove incompatible under particular circumstances. These necessary forms of evil call for creative responses that minimize avoidable suffering while preserving the creative freedom that makes genuine value possible. Unnecessary forms of evil result from failures of creative synthesis that miss opportunities for more inclusive and harmonious forms of value, calling for moral responses that expand sympathetic understanding and develop more skillful approaches to creative integration. The relationship between individual moral development and social justice reveals how personal virtue and social reform are mutually supporting rather than competing enterprises. Unjust social institutions make individual moral development more difficult by limiting the opportunities and resources available for creative self-realization, while morally underdeveloped individuals make social reform more difficult by lacking the sympathetic understanding and creative skills necessary for building inclusive institutions. This means that effective moral action must address both personal and social dimensions simultaneously rather than focusing exclusively on either individual character or structural change. The cultivation of individual virtue and the creation of just institutions represent complementary aspects of the same fundamental project of maximizing creative possibilities for all members of the moral community. Whitehead's critique of modern civilization from a moral perspective emphasizes how technological and economic developments can either enhance or diminish the possibilities for moral development and social cooperation. Industrial civilization has created unprecedented opportunities for individual development and global communication, while also generating forms of alienation and exploitation that undermine both personal fulfillment and social solidarity. The challenge for contemporary ethics involves discovering how modern capabilities can be directed toward enhancing rather than diminishing the moral dimensions of human experience and social organization. This requires both individual commitment to moral development and collective effort to create institutional structures that support, rather than undermine, the creative possibilities that constitute genuine human flourishing. The global scope of contemporary moral challenges requires ethical frameworks that can address planetary-scale issues while remaining grounded in the concrete experiences of particular individuals and communities. Environmental destruction, economic inequality, cultural conflict, and technological disruption all present moral problems that transcend traditional boundaries between personal and social ethics, requiring forms of moral imagination that can envision and work toward more inclusive and sustainable patterns of global civilization. Process ethics provides resources for addressing these challenges by revealing the fundamental interdependence that connects individual fulfillment with social justice and environmental sustainability in a single cosmic process of creative development. The ultimate goal of moral development involves learning to participate consciously and effectively in this cosmic creativity, contributing to forms of civilizational advance that enhance, rather than diminish, the creative possibilities available to all forms of life on Earth and potentially beyond. Part 16. The Philosophy of Education and Civilizational Critique. Education occupies a central position in Whitehead's practical philosophy as the primary means through which individuals develop their creative capacities while contributing to the cultural transmission and development of civilizational achievements. Traditional educational approaches often treat learning as either passive reception of established information or mechanical acquisition of useful skills, missing the fundamentally creative nature of genuine educational development. Process education aims to cultivate the creative capacities that enable students to participate actively in the ongoing creation of knowledge, culture, and social institutions, rather than merely inheriting completed achievements from previous generations. This requires educational methods that balance respect for inherited wisdom with encouragement of creative innovation, enabling students to master traditional knowledge while developing the capacity to extend and transform it in response to new circumstances and challenges. The rhythm of education reflects the natural patterns of creative development that characterize all forms of learning, from elementary perception to advanced theoretical understanding. This rhythm involves 3 stages: the stage of romance, where students encounter new material with curiosity and excitement; the stage of precision, where they master the systematic relationships and technical skills necessary for competent performance; and the stage of generalization, where they learn to apply their mastery creatively to new situations and problems. Educational programs that ignore this natural rhythm either bore students with premature emphasis on precision before romance has been established, or leave them unprepared for creative application by failing to develop adequate precision in fundamental skills and concepts. Effective education orchestrates these stages carefully, ensuring that each stage receives appropriate attention while contributing to the overall development of creative intellectual capacity. The critique of educational specialization reveals how the fragmentation of knowledge into isolated academic disciplines can undermine both individual development and social progress. While specialization enables the detailed investigation of particular domains that would be impossible through purely general approaches, excessive specialization can produce experts who lack the broad understanding necessary for creative synthesis and wise practical judgment. The challenge for modern education involves discovering how students can develop both specialized competence in particular fields and general understanding of how different fields relate to each other and to the broader challenges facing contemporary civilization. This requires interdisciplinary approaches that reveal the underlying unity of knowledge while respecting the distinctive methods and insights that emerge through specialized investigation. The relationship between theoretical and practical education challenges false dichotomies that treat abstract thinking and concrete action as fundamentally opposed activities. Theoretical understanding without practical application remains empty speculation that fails to engage with the concrete realities it purports to illuminate, while practical skills without theoretical understanding remain blind technique that cannot adapt creatively to new situations. Effective education integrates theoretical and practical dimensions by showing how abstract principles emerge from and apply to concrete experiences, enabling students to develop both the conceptual sophistication necessary for deep understanding and the practical wisdom necessary for effective action. This integration is particularly important in professional education, where students must learn to apply general principles creatively to particular cases that require both technical competence and ethical sensitivity. The aesthetic dimension of education involves cultivating sensitivity to the forms of beauty and meaning that emerge through successful creative synthesis in all domains of human activity. This aesthetic education cannot be confined to specialized courses in art and literature, but must pervade all educational activities, helping students recognize and appreciate the elegance of mathematical proofs, the beauty of scientific theories, the craft of skilled practical work, and the harmony of well-functioning social institutions. Aesthetic sensitivity provides the immediate appreciation of value that motivates continued learning and creative effort, while serving as a guide for recognizing which achievements are genuinely worthwhile, rather than merely technically correct or socially approved. Without aesthetic education, students may master information and skills without developing the judgment necessary to use them wisely and creatively in service of valuable goals. Whitehead's analysis of universities reveals both their essential function in preserving and advancing civilizational achievements and their tendency to become bureaucratic institutions that stifle rather than nurture creative development. Universities at their best provide communities of learning where students and faculty collaborate in the investigation of fundamental questions that require both specialized expertise and broad understanding. They preserve the accumulated wisdom of human civilization while creating new knowledge that extends this wisdom in response to contemporary challenges and opportunities. But universities can also become rigid bureaucracies that prioritize administrative efficiency over educational excellence, encouraging conformity to established procedures rather than creative exploration of new possibilities. The relationship between education and social reform reflects the reciprocal influence between individual development and institutional change in all areas of social life. Educational institutions both reflect and shape the broader culture, transmitting social values and patterns of thinking while potentially transforming them through the creative activities of educated individuals. This means that educational reform can contribute to broader social progress by developing individuals with the knowledge, skills and values necessary for creating more just and sustainable forms of social organization. But educational institutions cannot achieve such reform independently of broader social changes that provide opportunities for educated individuals to apply their capacities effectively in service of social improvement. The critique of modern civilization reveals how technological and economic developments create both new opportunities and new challenges for educational development. Modern communication technologies make vast amounts of information instantly available while potentially undermining the sustained attention and disciplined thinking necessary for deep understanding. Economic pressures for immediate practical utility can reduce education to narrow job training while neglecting the broad cultural development necessary for responsible citizenship and meaningful personal life. The challenge for contemporary education involves learning to use modern capabilities to enhance, rather than diminish, the educational processes that develop genuine understanding, creative capacity, and wise judgment. The global dimension of contemporary education reflects the interconnectedness of modern civilization while requiring respect for the diversity of cultural traditions that contribute different insights to human understanding. Global education must help students understand how local developments are influenced by and influence global processes while avoiding both parochial nationalism and homogenizing globalism that eliminates cultural diversity. This requires educational approaches that can appreciate the universal human capacities for learning, creativity, and moral development, while recognizing the particular cultural forms through which these capacities are developed and expressed in different societies. The goal is to prepare students for effective participation in global civilization, while enabling them to contribute the distinctive insights and values of their particular cultural traditions to the broader human conversation. The ultimate aim of education involves preparing individuals to participate creatively and responsibly in what Whitehead called the adventure of ideas, the ongoing human effort to understand reality more adequately and organize social life more wisely. This adventure requires both intellectual courage to question established beliefs and practical wisdom to implement beneficial changes without destroying valuable achievements. Educated individuals must be capable of both preserving the best of inherited civilization and transforming it in response to new opportunities and challenges that require creative solutions not available in traditional approaches. Education succeeds when it produces individuals who can contribute to this adventure through their particular talents and circumstances, while supporting others who contribute through different talents and circumstances. The health of civilization depends on educational institutions that can nurture such individuals while creating the social conditions necessary for their creative collaboration in the ongoing construction of more valuable forms of human community. This makes education not merely preparation for adult life, but a fundamental dimension of the creative process through which civilization continuously recreates itself in response to the evolving challenges and opportunities of human existence in a dynamic universe. Part 17. Mathematics, Logic, and the Foundations of Knowledge. Whitehead's mathematical and logical work provided the foundation for his later philosophical system, while revealing the relational and processual character of even the most abstract forms of human knowledge. His collaboration with Bertrand Russell on Principia Mathematica demonstrated that mathematical truths could be derived from logical principles, but this project also revealed the creative and constructive dimensions involved in all mathematical reasoning. Mathematics is not simply the discovery of pre-existing abstract objects, but rather the creative construction of systematic relationships that can be applied to diverse domains of experience. This insight prepared the way for understanding all knowledge as involving creative synthesis between inherited patterns and novel possibilities, rather than passive reflection of independent realities. The method of extensive abstraction, which Whitehead developed in his mathematical work on geometry and relativity theory, provides a model for understanding how precise concepts can emerge from vague experiential starting points through systematic logical construction. Traditional approaches to geometry assumed that points, lines and planes existed as fundamental entities from which extended figures could be constructed. But this led to logical paradoxes about the relationship between dimensionless points and dimensional extensions. Whitehead's alternative derived these precise geometric entities as limits of converging series of extended regions, showing how exactness emerges through systematic abstraction from inexact but concrete experiences of spatial relationships. This method eliminates the mystery of how abstract mathematical entities relate to concrete physical processes by revealing mathematical abstractions as systematically derived from the extensive relationships that organize actual experience. The logical foundations of mathematics reveal both the systematic character of rational thinking and the creative freedom involved in constructing logical systems. Logical principles like the law of non-contradiction and the principle of excluded middle are not arbitrary human conventions, but reflect genuine constraints on coherent thinking that emerge from the systematic relationships between eternal objects. But the construction of particular logical systems requires creative decisions about which primitive concepts and axioms to adopt, how to define derived concepts, and which theorems to prove or applications to develop. This makes mathematical knowledge both objectively constrained by logical relationships and subjectively creative in its selection and development of particular systematic possibilities. The relationship between mathematics and natural science illuminates how abstract mathematical structures can provide insight into concrete physical processes without requiring mathematical entities to exist independently of the processes they describe. Mathematical physics succeeds because actual occasions achieve their definiteness through relationships that exhibit mathematical characteristics, making mathematical description a form of abstract insight into concrete processes rather than mere conventional symbolism. But mathematical models necessarily abstract from the full concreteness of natural processes to focus on those aspects that can be precisely measured and systematically related, requiring careful attention to what gets omitted as well as what gets included in mathematical representations. This explains both the remarkable effectiveness of mathematics in natural science and its limitations when treated as a complete description of natural processes. Whitehead's critique of purely formal approaches to logic and mathematics emphasizes the experiential foundations that ground abstract reasoning in concrete processes of thought and communication. Formal systems can be manipulated according to syntactic rules without attention to their semantic content or practical applications, but such manipulation remains merely mechanical computation, unless it serves the creative purposes of thinking beings who seek to understand and transform their experience. The meaning and value of mathematical and logical systems depend on their capacity to illuminate experiential relationships and enable more effective practical action rather than their conformity to purely formal criteria of consistency and completeness. This makes mathematical and logical knowledge inherently purposive and evaluative rather than merely mechanical and neutral. The problem of infinity in mathematics and logic receives sophisticated treatment through Whitehead's analysis of the relationship between actual and potential infinities. Actual infinities involve completed totalities that contain infinitely many elements, while potential infinities involve ongoing processes that can be continued without limit but never achieve completion. Classical mathematics often treated infinite sets as actual infinities that somehow exist as completed totalities, leading to logical paradoxes and conceptual difficulties about the nature of mathematical existence. Whitehead's alternative treats mathematical infinities as systematic relationships between finite procedures that can be extended indefinitely without ever achieving actual completion, grounding infinite mathematics in finite processes of construction and inference. The educational implications of Whitehead's approach to mathematics and logic emphasize the creative and constructive dimensions of mathematical thinking rather than mere mechanical manipulation of symbolic systems. Mathematical education should help students understand how mathematical concepts emerge from concrete experiential relationships and how mathematical reasoning involves creative construction of systematic possibilities rather than passive discovery of pre-existing truths. This requires pedagogical approaches that connect abstract mathematical concepts with their concrete applications, while developing students' capacity for creative mathematical construction and systematic logical inference. Students should learn to appreciate both the objective constraints that govern coherent mathematical reasoning and the creative freedom involved in developing particular mathematical systems and applications. The relationship between symbolic logic and natural language reveals both the advantages and limitations of formal approaches to reasoning and communication. Symbolic logic achieves precision and systematic rigor that natural language often lacks, enabling complex inferences to be evaluated reliably and systematic relationships to be explored effectively. But natural language preserves connections to concrete experience and practical purposes that formal systems necessarily abstract away, making natural language essential for relating abstract reasoning to lived experience and meaningful action. Effective thinking requires both the precision of formal logic and the richness of natural language, using each to complement and correct the limitations of the other. The foundational crisis in early 20th century mathematics, provoked by paradoxes in set theory and disagreements about the nature of mathematical existence, provides a historical context for understanding Whitehead's philosophical approach to knowledge and reality. This crisis revealed that even the most rigorous and systematic forms of human knowledge remain grounded in creative decisions about fundamental concepts and principles that cannot be justified by appeal to mechanical procedures or external authorities. Whitehead's response emphasized the need for philosophical frameworks that could acknowledge this creative dimension while preserving the objective constraints that make rational criticism and progressive development possible. This prepared the way for understanding all knowledge as involving creative interpretation rather than passive reflection, while maintaining standards of adequacy and coherence that distinguish better from worse interpretations. The contemporary development of computer science and artificial intelligence raises new questions about the relationship between mathematical formalization and concrete intelligence that Whitehead's work anticipates and illuminates. Computers can manipulate formal symbolic systems with speed and accuracy that exceed human capacities, but they lack the experiential grounding and creative synthesis that characterize genuine understanding and intelligent action. This suggests that mathematical and logical formalization, however sophisticated, cannot capture the full reality of intelligent experience without being supplemented by the kinds of creative synthesis and evaluative judgment that characterize conscious experience. Whitehead's philosophy provides resources for understanding both the achievements and limitations of formal approaches to intelligence, while pointing toward more adequate conceptions that could integrate formal precision with experiential concreteness and creative freedom. Part 18. Evolution, Emergence, and the Creative Advance of Nature. Evolution represents far more than a biological mechanism in Whitehead's cosmic philosophy, extending to encompass the fundamental creative advance through which the universe generates increasingly complex forms of order and experience. This cosmic evolution operates at every level, from subatomic processes to astronomical development, exhibiting the same basic pattern of creative experimentation followed by selective inheritance that characterizes biological evolution. But evolutionary development transcends mechanical causation by incorporating the creative activity of actual occasions that constantly explore new possibilities for synthesis and occasionally achieve innovations that open up entirely new forms of order and experience. Evolution becomes a creative adventure rather than merely a mechanical process, involving genuine risk and genuine achievement at every stage of cosmic development. The emergence of novel forms of order through evolutionary development requires careful analysis to avoid both reductionist elimination and dualist separation of different levels of reality. Each evolutionary advance builds upon previous achievements while transcending them through new forms of organization that exhibit characteristics not present in their component parts. The emergence of life from non-living matter introduces forms of purposive activity and adaptive response that are genuinely novel while remaining grounded in the creative activities of actual occasions that follow the same fundamental principles operating at physical levels. Similarly, the emergence of consciousness from unconscious life introduces new forms of creative synthesis and symbolic representation that transcend biological adaptation while remaining continuous with the experiential activities that characterize all actual occasions. The problem of evolutionary directionality challenges both purely mechanistic accounts that eliminate genuine purpose from natural development and teleological accounts that impose predetermined goals on evolutionary processes. Mechanistic evolution can explain how successful variations are preserved and propagated, but cannot explain how variations arise or why evolution tends toward increasing complexity and consciousness rather than remaining stably simple. Teleological evolution can explain directional development, but typically requires external guidance that violates the autonomy and creativity of evolving organisms. Whitehead's solution locates evolutionary direction in the creative activity of evolving occasions themselves, which constantly experiment with new forms of order while being guided by aesthetic criteria that favor forms of experience exhibiting greater intensity, complexity, and harmony. The role of environmental challenge in stimulating evolutionary innovation reveals the creative character of adaptation rather than mere mechanical adjustment to external pressures. Environmental changes present evolving organisms with new problems that require creative solutions not available through simple repetition of established behaviors or structures. These challenges stimulate the exploration of new possibilities that might enable survival and reproduction under changed conditions. But the specific innovations that emerge cannot be predicted from environmental pressures alone because they require creative synthesis of inherited capacities with novel organizational possibilities. This makes evolutionary adaptation inherently creative and unpredictable while remaining causally grounded in the interaction between organisms and environments. The social dimensions of evolution extend beyond individual survival and reproduction to encompass the cultural transmission of learned innovations and the cooperative construction of new forms of social organization. Human evolution exhibits distinctive characteristics because cultural learning can transmit acquired characteristics across generations much more rapidly than genetic inheritance. accelerating evolutionary development while introducing new forms of creative possibility. Language enables the accumulation and systematic development of knowledge and skills that transcend individual biological capacities, creating cultural traditions that can evolve independently of biological evolution while remaining grounded in human biological capacities for learning, communication and cooperation. This cultural evolution follows the same basic pattern of creative experimentation, followed by selective inheritance that characterizes biological evolution, but it operates much more rapidly and with much greater conscious direction than purely biological processes. The emergence of rational consciousness introduces forms of evolutionary development that can become partially self-directing through conscious understanding of evolutionary processes and deliberate effort to guide evolutionary outcomes. Human beings can study their own evolutionary history and current evolutionary pressures while making conscious choices about which evolutionary directions they want to support or discourage through their individual and collective actions. This makes contemporary evolution partly conscious and deliberate rather than purely automatic, introducing new responsibilities for wise stewardship of evolutionary development while preserving the creative freedom that makes genuine innovation possible. The challenge involves learning to guide evolutionary development toward more valuable outcomes without eliminating the creative experimentation that makes evolutionary advance possible. The relationship between biological evolution and cosmic evolution reveals the continuity between life and its physical environment, while preserving the distinctive characteristics that emerge through biological organization. Living organisms are not separate from their physical environment, but represent highly organized societies of occasions that achieve distinctive forms of coordination and creative response, while remaining embedded in and dependent upon their broader cosmic context. This cosmic embeddedness means that biological evolution is influenced by astronomical development, geological change, and climate variation, while biological evolution reciprocally influences atmospheric composition, geological processes, and even astronomical observations through technological development. The biosphere and its physical environment co-evolve through their mutual interactions, rather than evolving independently according to separate principles. The future of evolution remains genuinely open because it depends on creative decisions not yet made by evolving occasions at all levels of organization. While current trends and established patterns provide clues about probable evolutionary directions, the creative character of evolutionary development means that genuinely novel forms of order and experience may emerge that cannot be predicted from current conditions. This evolutionary openness preserves hope for continued creative advance while recognizing that evolutionary development can also lead to decline, extinction, and the loss of valuable achievements if creative responses to environmental challenges prove inadequate. Human responsibility for conscious participation in evolutionary development becomes crucial for ensuring that future evolution continues the creative advance toward greater intensity, complexity, and harmony rather than declining toward simpler but less valuable forms of order. The cosmic scope of evolutionary development suggests that life and consciousness may be widespread throughout the universe, wherever conditions permit the emergence and sustenance of complex organized societies of occasions. The same physical and metaphysical principles that enabled the emergence of life and consciousness on Earth operate throughout the cosmic order, making it likely that similar evolutionary developments occur wherever suitable environmental conditions arise. This cosmic perspective on evolution transforms our understanding of humanity's place in the universe from isolated accident to local exemplification of cosmic creative processes that operate everywhere according to the same fundamental principles while achieving diverse forms of creative expression under different environmental conditions. Human evolution represents one particular line of cosmic creative advance that has achieved distinctive characteristics while remaining continuous with the broader evolutionary development that characterizes the entire universe. This makes human responsibility for wise evolutionary stewardship part of a cosmic creative adventure that transcends terrestrial boundaries, while beginning with conscientious care for the evolutionary possibilities available within our immediate cosmic neighborhood. The ultimate goal of conscious evolutionary participation involves learning to contribute effectively to the cosmic creative advance that has produced us while ensuring that our contributions enhance rather than diminish the creative possibilities available to future evolutionary development both on Earth and potentially throughout the cosmos. Part 19. Contemporary Criticisms and Philosophical Debates. Contemporary philosophical engagement with Whitehead's system reveals both its continuing relevance to current debates and the persistent challenges that prevent its widespread acceptance within mainstream philosophical communities. Analytic philosophers often criticize the speculative ambition of process philosophy as premature systematization that goes beyond what can be rigorously demonstrated through careful conceptual analysis and empirical investigation. Continental philosophers sometimes find Whitehead's systematic approach too systematic and rationalistic, preferring approaches that emphasize the irreducible complexity and historical contingency of human experience without attempting comprehensive metaphysical synthesis. Both criticisms reflect broader disagreements about the proper scope and methods of philosophical inquiry that have shaped academic philosophy throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. The problem of empirical testability poses significant challenges for evaluating Whitehead's metaphysical claims about the ultimate structure of reality. Scientific theories can be tested through controlled experiments and observational studies that provide evidence for or against their empirical predictions. But metaphysical theories, like process philosophy, make claims about aspects of reality that may not be directly observable or experimentally manipulable. Critics argue that if metaphysical theories cannot be empirically tested, they reduce to mere speculation or poetry that provides no genuine knowledge about the nature of reality. Defenders respond that metaphysical theories can be evaluated according to their systematic coherence, their capacity to illuminate diverse domains of experience, and their ability to resolve conceptual problems that arise within more limited theoretical approaches. The relationship between process philosophy and contemporary science generates both supportive evidence and challenging counterexamples that complicate simple assessments of empirical adequacy. Quantum mechanics and relativity theory do reveal features of nature that seem more compatible with process than substance ontology, supporting Whitehead's claim that process is more fundamental than substance. But contemporary physics operates effectively without requiring conscious experience at the quantum level, challenging Whitehead's panpsychist claim that all actual occasions involve primitive forms of experience. Neuroscience provides increasingly detailed accounts of consciousness that seem to support materialistic rather than experiential approaches to understanding mental phenomena, though these accounts also reveal the complexity and creativity of neural processes that process philosophy emphasizes. The combination problem continues to challenge process philosophy's account of how complex experiences like human consciousness can emerge from the coordination of countless simple experiential occasions. If every electron, photon and molecular event involves its own occasion of experience, how can billions of these micro-experiences combine to generate the unified stream of consciousness that characterizes human mental life? Traditional substance approaches avoid this problem by treating consciousness as a property of unified, substantial minds, but they face the equally difficult problem of explaining how consciousness relates to physical brain processes. Process philosophy offers resources for addressing the combination problem through its analysis of dominant occasions and social coordination. But critics argue that these resources remain too vague and speculative to provide adequate explanations of the unity of consciousness. The theological dimensions of process philosophy generate both enthusiastic support from process theologians and skeptical criticism from both traditional theists and secular philosophers. Traditional theists often find Whitehead's God too limited and temporal to deserve worship or provide ultimate meaning, while secular philosophers find any form of theism incompatible with naturalistic approaches to understanding reality. Process theologians argue that Whitehead's dipolar theism provides a more adequate understanding of divine nature than classical theism, while remaining compatible with evolutionary science and modern democratic values. But critics question whether process theology maintains sufficient continuity with traditional religious experience and practice to count as genuine theology, rather than philosophical poetry about cosmic processes. The political implications of process philosophy have been developed in diverse and sometimes conflicting directions by contemporary theorists interested in ecological, feminist and social justice applications. Ecological theorists appreciate the emphasis on interdependence and intrinsic value that supports environmental protection and sustainable development, while feminist theorists find resources for critiquing hierarchical and dualistic thinking that subordinates emotion, nature, and traditionally feminine values. Social justice theorists draw on process themes to develop approaches to economic and political reform that emphasize creative cooperation and mutual enhancement rather than competitive individualism or authoritarian collectivism. But critics argue that process philosophy's emphasis on harmony and creative synthesis may obscure the reality of irreconcilable conflicts and systematic oppression that require more confrontational approaches to social change. The educational implications of process philosophy have influenced alternative approaches to curriculum design and pedagogical practice, but they face significant challenges from more conventional approaches that emphasize measurable outcomes and standardized assessment. Process educators emphasize creative engagement, interdisciplinary synthesis, and the cultivation of aesthetic sensitivity as fundamental educational goals that cannot be reduced to mechanical skill acquisition or information transmission. But educational institutions face political and economic pressures to demonstrate accountability through standardized testing and measurable achievement that may be incompatible with process approaches to educational development. This creates tensions between process ideals and institutional realities that limit the practical implementation of process educational philosophy. The relationship between process philosophy and postmodern approaches reveals both affinities and fundamental disagreements about the nature of truth, rationality, and systematic knowledge. Both process and postmodern philosophers critique foundationalist approaches that seek absolute certainty and question substance metaphysics that treats reality as composed of independent entities with fixed essences. But process philosophy maintains commitments to systematic coherence and objective truth that many postmodern philosophers reject as vestiges of discredited Enlightenment rationalism. Process philosophers argue that their approach can accommodate legitimate postmodern insights about perspective, interpretation, and historical contingency, while avoiding the relativistic conclusions that make constructive philosophical work impossible. Contemporary developments in cognitive science, artificial intelligence and information theory have generated new challenges and opportunities for process approaches to understanding mind and knowledge. Computational approaches to cognition treat mental processes as information processing that can be implemented in digital computers, challenging process claims about the irreducibly experiential character of mental phenomena. But cognitive science also reveals the embodied, dynamic and creative character of intelligent behavior that supports process emphasis on temporal development and environmental interaction. The challenge for contemporary process philosophy involves engaging seriously with scientific developments while maintaining its distinctive insights about creativity, experience, and temporal becoming. The future development of process philosophy depends partly on its capacity to address these contemporary criticisms while preserving its systematic ambition and metaphysical insights. This may require more precise formulations of key concepts, more detailed engagement with empirical research, and more careful attention to the practical implications of process principles for addressing contemporary challenges. But it may also require broader changes in philosophical culture that become more receptive to systematic and speculative approaches that attempt comprehensive understanding rather than limiting philosophy to piecemeal conceptual analysis or cultural critique. The ultimate test of process philosophy's value lies in its continuing capacity to illuminate human experience and guide creative responses to the evolving challenges facing contemporary civilization. Part 20. Legacy, Influence and Future Directions. The influence of Whitehead's philosophy extends far beyond academic philosophy to encompass theology, environmental studies, educational theory, organizational management, and even scientific research programs that seek alternatives to mechanistic approaches to natural phenomena. This broad influence reflects both the comprehensive scope of process philosophy and its practical relevance to contemporary challenges that require creative and systematic responses. While process philosophy has never achieved dominance within mainstream academic philosophy, it has provided resources for diverse communities of scholars and practitioners who find mechanistic and dualistic approaches inadequate for their theoretical and practical needs. This pattern of influence suggests that process philosophy's ultimate significance may lie more in its practical applications than in its acceptance as an academic philosophical system. Process theology represents perhaps the most developed and influential application of Whiteheadian insights, providing resources for rethinking traditional theological concepts in ways that seem more compatible with evolutionary science, democratic values, and contemporary religious experience. Theologians like Charles Hartshorne, John Cobb, and David Griffin have developed sophisticated process theologies that address classical problems in philosophical theology while maintaining continuity with lived religious traditions. Process approaches to understanding divine nature, the problem of evil, the relationship between religion and science, and the meaning of religious experience have influenced Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, Buddhist, and Islamic theological reflection. But process theology remains controversial within traditional religious communities and faces the challenge of maintaining religious depth while accommodating scientific worldviews. Ecological applications of process philosophy have become increasingly important, as environmental challenges require new ways of understanding the relationship between human civilization and natural processes. Process emphasis on interdependence, intrinsic value, and creative cooperation provides conceptual resources for developing environmental ethics that avoid both anthropocentric exploitation of nature and romantic idealization that ignores human needs and capabilities. Ecological philosophers like J. Baird Callicott and Freya Matthews have drawn on process principles to develop environmental philosophies that treat human beings as creative participants in natural processes rather than external controllers or passive victims of environmental forces. These applications face the challenge of translating philosophical insights into effective environmental policies and practices that can address large-scale ecological problems. Educational applications of process philosophy have influenced alternative approaches to curriculum design, pedagogical practice, and institutional organization that emphasize creativity, interdisciplinary synthesis, and the cultivation of wisdom rather than mere information transmission or skill training. Educators like John Dewey, Maria Montessori, and Parker Palmer have developed educational approaches that share many process themes, though their historical connections to Whitehead's philosophy are often indirect. Process educational theory emphasizes the natural rhythm of learning, the importance of aesthetic experience in intellectual development, and the need for educational institutions that support rather than stifle creative capacity. But these educational ideals face significant challenges from standardized testing requirements, economic pressures for measurable outcomes, and institutional structures that prioritize efficiency over creativity. Organizational applications of process principles have influenced management theory, business practice, and social entrepreneurship approaches that emphasize creative collaboration, adaptive learning, and systemic thinking, rather than hierarchical control and competitive individualism. Management theorists like Peter Senge and Margaret Wheatley have developed organizational approaches that draw on process themes about emergence, complexity, and creative adaptation. These applications treat organizations as creative communities that must constantly adapt to changing environments while maintaining their core purposes and values through the creative contributions of all their members. The challenge involves implementing these ideals within economic and political systems that often reward short-term competitive advantage over long-term creative collaboration. Scientific applications of process insights have influenced research programs in complexity theory, systems biology, ecological modeling, and even quantum mechanics interpretation that seek alternatives to purely mechanistic approaches to natural phenomena. Scientists like Stuart Kauffman, Lynn Margulis, and Fritjof Capra have developed scientific approaches that emphasize creativity, emergence, and holistic relationships in natural processes. These applications do not typically require accepting Whitehead's full metaphysical system, but draw on process themes about temporal development, creative emergence, and systematic interconnection that seem supported by contemporary scientific research. The challenge involves developing these insights into empirically testable theories that can advance scientific understanding while remaining open to the creative and experiential dimensions that process philosophy emphasizes. Contemporary philosophical developments in embodied cognition, enactive approaches to perception, and ecological psychology exhibit significant affinities with process themes about the temporal and relational character of experience. Philosophers and cognitive scientists like Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Francisco Varela, and James J. Gibson have developed approaches to understanding mind and knowledge that emphasize embodied interaction with environmental processes rather than abstract computational information processing. These developments provide empirical and phenomenological support for many process insights while avoiding the speculative metaphysical commitments that make process philosophy controversial within scientific communities. The relationship between these contemporary developments and classical process philosophy remains an area of active investigation that may influence future developments in both scientific and philosophical understanding of mind and nature. Feminist philosophy has found significant resources in process emphasis on relationship, care, and creative synthesis as alternatives to masculine-coded emphasis on independence, control, and analytical separation. Feminist philosophers like Nell Noddings, Carol Gilligan, and Val Plumwood have developed approaches to ethics, epistemology, and environmental philosophy that share many process themes about the priority of relationship and the importance of care in human development. These applications do not require accepting Whitehead's systematic metaphysics, but draw on process insights about interdependence and creativity that support feminist critiques of traditional philosophical approaches. The challenge involves developing these insights into comprehensive alternatives that can address both traditional philosophical problems and contemporary feminist concerns about justice, care, and sustainable development. The future of process philosophy depends partly on its capacity to engage constructively with contemporary developments in science, technology, and global culture, while maintaining its distinctive insights about creativity, experience, and systematic understanding. This may require developing process principles in new directions that address challenges like artificial intelligence, global climate change, cultural diversity, and technological disruption that were not central concerns during Whitehead's lifetime. It may also require new forms of philosophical collaboration that can develop process insights through interdisciplinary research programs rather than purely academic philosophical investigation. The ultimate test of process philosophy's continuing relevance lies in its capacity to provide resources for creative responses to evolving human challenges, rather than its acceptance within particular academic communities. The global dimension of contemporary challenges suggests that process philosophy's emphasis on creative cooperation and systematic thinking may become increasingly relevant as humanity faces problems that require unprecedented forms of international collaboration and long-term thinking. Climate change, technological development, economic inequality, and cultural conflict all present challenges that cannot be addressed through traditional approaches based on competitive nationalism and short-term self-interest. Process principles about interdependence, creative synthesis, and temporal development may provide conceptual resources for developing more adequate responses to these global challenges, but only if they can be translated into effective political and economic practices. The future significance of process philosophy may depend more on its practical applications than on its theoretical development, making the work of process-influenced practitioners in diverse fields as important as the work of academic process philosophers. Whether process philosophy achieves lasting influence will depend on its capacity to contribute to the creative advance of civilization toward more sustainable, just, and beautiful forms of global community that can support the creative development of all forms of life on Earth and potentially beyond. This makes every application of process principles a contribution to the cosmic creative advance that Whitehead identified as the ultimate meaning and purpose of existence itself.